The Jeffrey Epstein story. What is it? What does it really mean? Just asking questions. I had a conversation with journalist Michael Tracey about this because he's been picking apart what he calls the Epstein mythology for the past several weeks over at his Substack. In short, he thinks 90% of what most people believe about this case is false, and that this is mostly the fault of credulous establishment journalists who chose to uncritically publish alleged victims' narratives and ignore inconvenient facts, as well as opportunistic alternative media figures who spun the story into a sprawling conspiracy for political and personal gain. Tracey has been attacked and on the attack, and you'll hear him air his many grievances with other journalists, lawyers, and politicians in this conversation, including Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, whom he calls out as his enemy because she instructed police to remove him from an Epstein-related press conference after he asked a question about an accuser's credibility in Washington, D.C. last week. My goal here was to move beyond the personality clashes and egos and wild speculation and drill down into what it is we actually know and don't know about Jeffrey Epstein. But as we talked, it became clear that this kind of detached analysis just wasn't going to be possible, that the egos and the clashes and the agendas remain intricately tied up with how this story has unfolded. The incentives faced by establishment journalists, podcasters, accusers, and politicians have shaped this story, and our understanding of it's mostly for the worse. But the marketplace of ideas is real, and there is a countervailing incentive to move against the herd and correct the record. And maybe a turbulent and confrontational personality like Michael Tracey, who admits that he's wired differently, was what was needed to break some taboos, ask uncomfortable questions, and push for real disclosure about the nature of the story that has loomed over American politics for at least a decade now. A couple notes. One is that this was recorded late last week, so we don't discuss some very recently published material, such as a doodle and letter that Trump allegedly wrote to Epstein. And this conversation has been edited for time and clarity. I don't expect everyone to like Michael Tracey's tone or agree with every aspect of his analysis. For instance, I remain more suspicious than Tracey is of many of the figures who continued orbiting Epstein after his conviction. I still wonder about whether there was some blackmail going on, and you'll hear that disagreement and uncertainty play out. But anyone who purports to care about this story, I think, should at least engage with the questions he's asking and start asking your own questions about what the Epstein story really means.
The weird just asking question.
There must be conspiracy, and you're just asking questions.
We're just asking questions.
Just asking questions. Just asking questions.
We are entering into an epistemological crisis.
You cannot cope with vast amounts of information in the old fragmentary classified patterns.
In this information crisis,
there was a notion that unfettered communication was always going to be good.
The right to speak comes from our rights to know.
Michael Tracey, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk this through with you today, because the Jeffrey Epstein case, to me, it's been like this thick fog hanging over politics and media for close to a decade now, and it's one that's particularly disorienting, because it's a fog of innuendo, political opportunism, some trolling, and then also just legitimately repulsive crimes and genuine uncertainty about how far and deep the case actually reaches. And what I appreciate, Michael, is that I see you in recent weeks as trying to clear some of that fog by insisting on firmer grounding in fact to tell the larger Epstein story over at your Substack. And I want to try to continue that process today by going fairly methodically through the most common claims about Epstein and then looking at evidence for those claims. And I want to give our best account at the end of what the real Epstein story is as we know it and what should be done next about it. First, though, let me ask you, Why did you decide over these past few weeks to step right into the Epstein fog?
Yeah, so I guess just by way of introduction, it's true that this has hung like a fog of sorts over American politics for a decade or more, but I do think it's worth underscoring how dominant it's been just very recently, particularly since July 6th, which is the date that the Department of Justice and FBI put out their joint memo purporting to disclose renewed investigative findings around the Jeffrey Epstein matter that had been undertaken by the second Trump administration. That's what really launched what I'm endearingly calling the summer of Epstein, which I guess we're at the tail end of now. And so, I wouldn't overlook that Congress, I'm in D.C. right now, Congress just returned from its August recess, and it seems pretty clear that the number one issue on the agenda is Jeffrey Epstein. And the July session of Congress, or the House anyway, was prematurely adjourned by Speaker Mike Johnson over Jeffrey Epstein. So while the issue has stretched on for quite a long time, I think there's a particular salience now, or an immediacy to it for whatever reason, that's erupted probably since the beginning of this summer. And so that's why I perceive some degree of immediacy or urgency in why it needs to be subjected to a little bit more rigorous critical examination. I had been intermittently following the story probably since early 2015, in that every couple months, let's say, there would be some new development that I would look into, whether it's litigation or a new filing or new documents being dumped. But over the course of that time, I was becoming much more wary, increasingly wary of some of the validity of some of the core claims that seem to undergird what I am sometimes referring to as the Epstein mythology. There are some real, let's say, aspects to the whole Epstein story, so it's not pure mythology as though it's just been invented by somebody or hallucinated completely. But there is a lot of mythology that's sort of coalesced or congealed around the story that I thought it was a worthwhile journalistic endeavor to kind of forensically dissect. Otherwise, in my judgment anyway, one just allows this mass hysteria and moral panic to proliferate unchecked. And I think when mass panics or mass hysterias and moral panics are allowed to proliferate unchecked, it has a lot of adverse downstream effects, like abridgment of civil liberties, like widespread misdiagnosis of genuine political problems, such as around U.S. foreign policy, and also just a kind of allowing irrational sort of frenzy to swirl in a way that I think is just intrinsically damaging. So for those and other reasons, I kind of embarked on this examination of Epstein, the whole Epstein saga, almost from the ground up, because I felt it was worth taking a fresh look, not really taking any premises for granted, and really being tethered to the primary source material, of which there's a huge overabundance, that lots of people who claim to be invested in this story, whether politically or psychically or what have you, don't seem that interested in actually delving into, but I've done it.
Yeah, so I want to go through sort of step-by-step aspects of what you call the Epstein mythology. But first, I just want to see if we can agree on some base facts about what we think Epstein, what we agree that Epstein is guilty of, and some things that, some really, I think, disgusting things that did happen. So first, I'm just going to pull up the 2019 federal indictment and read from that a little bit. Here it is. The government says, during all time periods charged in this indictment, Epstein enticed and recruited and caused to be enticed and recruited dozens of minor girls to engage in sex acts with him, after which Epstein paid the victims hundreds of dollars in cash at the New York residence and his Palm Beach residence. In both New York and Florida, he initially recruited to provide, quote, victims were initially recruited to provide, quote, massages to Epstein, which would be performed nude or partially nude and then become increasingly sexual in nature. Epstein encouraged certain of his victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly sexually abused and paid these victim recruiters hundreds of dollars for each girl that they brought to Epstein. So are we in agreement that Epstein was paying underage girls for sex and to recruit other underage girls?
Well, we're definitely not in agreement if your position would be that indictment, that 2019 indictment, should be taken as dispositive proof of anything. I know you haven't said that outright, but that's just a set of allegations by the government that never were fully adjudicated because Epstein died in federal custody. What is true is that in 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state-level charges in Florida. So if we want to talk about what it can be reasonably agreed that Epstein did or what he was guilty of, we could just look to what he pleaded guilty to. And in June of 2008, he pleaded guilty to 2 state-level counts in Florida. One was felony solicitation of prostitution, so that had to do with adults who he solicited to engage in prostitution. He had been indicted by a Palm Beach County grand jury in 2006 on that charge. And later on, the feds essentially interceded because it was seen as intolerable by Palm Beach cops, essentially, police investigators, that Epstein would be allowed to simply plead to that prostitution charge and be able to wash his hands of everything that he had been investigated for since 2005. So through this very convoluted, extended process whereby the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office in South Florida interceded in what had up to that point been a local case, that eventually culminated in the addition of another charge through this non-prosecution agreement that Epstein was compelled to plead guilty to. Otherwise, he would face a federal indictment. And he pleaded guilty to a second charge, which was procurement of person under 18 for prostitution. So that's person singular. It's kind of a weird sort of legally opaque process in terms of how they determined that was, well, I shouldn't say opaque. In terms of what he pleaded guilty to, the government merely had to establish that there was one victim under the age of 18 whom Epstein procured for prostitution, because Florida has one of the highest ages of consent in the entire world. I would say it's 18 years old. And so if you go and look at the transcript of when Epstein entered his guilty plea on June 30th, 2008, there's a particular victim that's referenced as the impetus for the plea in relation to that charge. And it was by that time, a woman who said that she was, when she was 17, she engaged in sexual acts with Epstein that she said, if you go look at her police interview, and it's available for anybody to go look at. Please don't take my word for it. Go on the Palm Beach County website. They've done a massive FOIA dump or not a FOIA dump, but they've done a massive documents dump or records dump as of July 2024 after Ron DeSantis signed legislation in Florida that permitted the release of certain materials like grand jury materials that would have otherwise been sealed. But you can go look at some of the original police interviews. And this young woman who is being interviewed says that when she was 17, she did have sexual contact with Epstein, including intercourse, full intercourse, which is a bit rare for Epstein if you look at his habits. But he had full intercourse the day before she turned 18. That's not me saying it. That is the purported victim saying it. And she also, told the police investigator that it was consensual. So I'm not, just so everybody's clear, I'm not condoning a man in his 50s even coming close to potentially engaging in sexually explicit or illicit acts with teenage girls, whether they're just above or just below the age of consent. It's a bad idea for everybody involved. But I do think it's worth being clear as to what he actually pleaded guilty to in that Florida matter. And, I think there are due process standards that need to be upheld no matter how abominable we regard somebody, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or a mass murderer or name your other villain.
I think that that's completely legitimate to want to uphold due process in the court of law, but we're also, this is a story that we as the public and as journalists are trying to, decide what to believe about, and we have to be Bayesian about it and decide, you're looking at one case, you're looking at the state of Florida's case against Jeffrey Epstein. I brought up the federal case where they're referencing the existence of dozens of minors. There's the Ghislaine Maxwell case, which also references minors. Would you just discount that and say we should not take it seriously? Or could a reasonable person conclude at this point, Jeffrey Epstein was probably engaging in sexual acts with minors and paying them and asking these minors to recruit other minors for him? Is that not fairly well established at this point?
No, it's fairly well established that in the early 2000s, let's say from roughly 2002 to 2005, Jeffrey Epstein did go through a phase of sorts where he was more reckless. He was not very scrupulous about checking whether the young girls or teenage girls who were ferried constantly into his Palm Beach house were of legal age. And he was addicted pathologically to receiving massages, whether they, constantly, multiple times a day, whether they were sexualized or not. Oftentimes they were, sometimes they weren't. He was just addicted to massages in a way that I personally could never relate to. And I don't think most people could. It really was bizarre behavior. And
was he addicted
there were
to the massage, or was he addicted to the happy ending?
I think both. Both. We don't have to get too graphic, but much of the time he's reported to have often, masturbated himself in the presence of teenage girls or young women who he would ask to strip down to their undergarments or to expose themselves with varying degrees of nudity. And, there are certainly, I think, well-established instances where there were girls who, whether because they lied to him about their age or he was just negligent about checking their age, or even part of him didn't want to actively check their ages, clearly, statutorily, they were not of legal age to engage in sexual activity with an adult. So that did happen, I think, and it's well established it did in the Palm Beach case in the early 2000s. But I think, a problem here is that, so one way that I've sort of been synthesizing all this just in terms of a shorthand encapsulation is that my basic elevator pitch is that approximately 90% of what people think they confidently know about this entire case or this entire saga is either wildly exaggerated or outright fictitious. But there is another 10% that's roughly true or true enough, or at least based on some reality, and it has to do overwhelmingly with that period in the early 2000s where he was having parades of young women or girls, some of whom would have been 18 or over, or some of whom might have been in the same sort of social cohort but would have been under 18. These females were constantly visiting him at his house for massages of varying degrees of sexualization. So that is basically true. But the problem is that people then have used that to make these grandiose extrapolations about a massive, wide-scale child sex trafficking operation that was, international or implicated all these prominent people in grievous sex crimes against minors and that was enforced by blackmail, et cetera. That's sort of how the mythology works. There's a kernel of truth, and then that kernel of truth has, water poured on it continuously, then it grows into something that really doesn't resemble the original kernel of truth. So yes, there is some stuff that has to do with the Palm Beach case originally that is accurate. Actually, in the proffer interview that Ghislaine Maxwell very recently did on, I believe it was July 24th, with Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, and the transcript came out only about 2 weeks ago now. She actually gave some additional insight into what might have been going on with Epstein around that period in the early 2000s, which is, she said that she observed behavioral changes in Epstein around that time. She says he got more aggressive.
Clip actually, Michael.
Yeah.
So let's just play it. I read through your Substack, which I encourage everyone to do, regardless of how much you agree or disagree with Michael Tracey's analysis. If you care about this case, I think you owe it to yourself to at least read what he's put out there. And you did the work of reading through these transcripts of Ghislaine's, was it a deposition?
It was a proffer interview, so it's not a deposition. It's a different legal category.
And yes, there's also recordings, and we pulled this relevant bit of the recording where she talks about this kind of phase shift in Epstein's life. Let's play that, John.
He started doing testosterone, and that altered his character. And I believe that started in the late 90s. And I believe that the FBI has his medical records, and you may see that on his medical records.
So you believe that he started taking testosterone in the 90s, and when you say that altered his behavior, you're saying it made him get more massages, or that was just one part of what changed about him?
Well, he became more aggressive.
Nice.
And I think that he may be, well, now I'm just imagining that the testosterone altered his desires or something.
So, what did that pull into focus for you?
Well, she actually says elsewhere that she observed him taking what she considered to be disturbingly high doses of testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
And that does ring true in that it would seem to accord with him appearing to have become more reckless, maybe more impulsive, maybe having more of an insatiable sex drive during that period in the early 2000s. Those would all be, fairly predictable effects of consuming excessive doses of testosterone. So that gives some color to what might have been going on around that time that gave rise to this behavioral change, and therefore his indulgence in these definitely very questionable sexual activities and establishment of questionable habits, where he's being constantly provided with this endless stream of young women, whether they're technically above the age of consent in Florida or not. Actually, just to make a broader point about that Maxwell proffer interview, it's genuinely fascinating. Maybe I'm biased because I've been so immersed in this issue, but think about it. Ghislaine Maxwell says that the very first time she has ever been asked by any government authority, any police investigator, anybody in the federal law enforcement apparatus, to simply describe her role or her observations in relation to what is otherwise being declared to have been the most prolific child sex trafficking operation in American history or world history. I mean, who knows? It's hard to keep track of the histrionics. But she says that the very first time that she's ever been approached to simply give her observations about her involvement in this was July of 2025. Really? That, I think, should tell you that there's something that's a little askew in how much of this has been presented to the public. Whether or not you want to take anything that she says at face value, whether or not you deem her credible, I think it really is bizarre for her not to have even been asked to elucidate what she perceived to have been going on and what her role within it was.
Well, yeah, I mean, we certainly shouldn't take anything she says at face value, given that she has a motive to conceal any involvement that she had in sex trafficking, and to
Well, not really.
downplay
What is her motive at
anything.
this point? She's already been convicted. She might have a motive to flatter Donald Trump.
Yes, which she does in that proffer, and that implies to me that she would like a pardon, and it's a lot easier to pardon if you aren't kind of outright admitting that you were sex trafficking minors to Jeffrey Epstein.
She maintains her innocence. I've come to the conclusion with like 95% or more certainty that she was in fact wrongfully convicted, and shows she's wrongfully imprisoned right now. And she was subjected to extremely harsh, almost torturous conditions. Like when she was in federal jail prior to her trial in 2021 in Brooklyn, she would be awoken every 15 minutes by the jail authorities, so she could never sleep. She was in solitary confinement. And she was never even accused of any violent crime at all. Even the claims about her personally participating in any illicit sexual acts are extremely tenuous. So she was basically a victim of this confluence of political and legal circumstances that zeroed in on her as the proxy of Epstein, who was dead at that point. And they needed a scalp, right? The government needed a scalp. The public needed a scalp. Everybody had been primed to really think that there was some kind of vengeance that had to be acquired here. And given that, I think she was convicted on totally false pretenses. That trial was a farce. When we can get into it. She would have a motive to seek clemency from the one person who can unilaterally provide it to her, which happens to be Donald J. Trump. And if that involves some flattery, which she did do in that interview, she said that she admired his accomplishment in becoming president again, etc. I think it's perfectly explicable why she would do that. Anybody who wants anything from Donald Trump heaps him with praise. So it's not that unusual.
Yeah, my only point there is that if you are, there's still motive to not just outright admit if you were involved with sex crimes. To just dig into why it is that you think that she was wrongfully convicted for a moment before we move on to some of the big claims, the kind of 90% that you say is the Epstein mythology and not the 10% base reality. Is the reason for you thinking that Ghislaine Maxwell was wrongly convicted, that because of this, there are these different eras of Epstein, the sort of pre-testosterone ODing era where he was maybe getting a lot of massages but not preying on underage girls, and then the post-testosterone Palm Beach era where Ghislaine was less present. She was no longer in a relationship with Epstein at that point. She was in a relationship with another man, and like maybe still working with him, but not as directly. Is that your general take on it?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
But I think more starkly, there are huge due process and civil liberties issues that I would identify in association with her trial that I think the public is just not aware of at all, because almost nobody would have gone and read through all the trial transcripts. I have. So, for instance, there are civil liberties problems and also evidentiary problems. Okay. So on the civil liberties front, the judge in this case, Allison Nathan, federal judge in New York, permitted 2 of the 4 purported victims who the government called to testify against Maxwell to testify under fake names. One of these women was Anushka DeGiorgio, who, it so happens, spoke at the Epstein press conference outside the Capitol building yesterday. And this was a woman who had already come out into the public under her real name to describe her alleged experiences with Epstein and Maxwell. She had done an NBC News interview under her real name in September of 2019. She had appeared at a court hearing at the federal courthouse in New York in August of 2019 when the Judge Berman, did something incredibly unusual and incredibly dangerous, I would say, for civil liberties, which was that after Epstein was dead, he decided to convene this unprecedented hearing where these purported victims who were never adjudicated as victims, the defendant was never found guilty because he was deceased, were permitted to come to the courthouse and just rattle off all these allegations with the imprimatur of the court as though there had been done anything done to adequately substantiate the veracity of their claims. So she participated in that little farce. And she had done so under her real name. So by 2021, the claim was that she was in such mortal danger, or her safety was so compromised, would have been so compromised if she simply testified under her real name at this trial, that the judge allowed her to testify under a fake name. And why is that a problem? Well, in the United States, we have something called the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which affords the right for criminal defendants to confront their accusers. And Ghislaine Maxwell was deprived of that right. In fact, it's even worse, because if the government, if the prosecution, or if the court determines that a certain purported victim is entitled to pseudonymity, then that conveys a certain message to the jurors that this witness's claims have already been credibly corroborated in some fashion. Otherwise, why would they need that kind of protection, right? So that was a fatal flaw of this case. There was another individual who was also given the ability to testify pseudonymously, who was actually a soap opera actress. So, I mean, I don't know if she was performing at the trial or not, but there, then let's go to the evidentiary issues. I mean, there are other civil liberties issues too, but I don't want to belabor them too much. But on the evidentiary issues, so there was one witness. So we're told the DOJ and FBI memo of July 6, 2025 tells us that there are over 1,000 victims of Jeffrey Epstein. They don't specify who these purported victims are, or how it was determined that any given victim was in fact victimized. They just throw out this general term, like a nice round number, to get everybody riled up. And it's not clear whether that relates to pornography that was identified as having been in Epstein's possession when he was arrested in 2019 and his properties were raided.
Here's that memo you're referencing. Consistent with prior disclosures, this review confirmed that Epstein harmed over 1,000 victims. Each suffered unique trauma. Sensitive
Which is
information
weird
relating
language.
to these victims is intertwined throughout the materials.
Which is really weird language. Each suffered unique trauma. I mean, what are we in, like some grad school, like struggle session? Or like, and what does it mean to have been, for a victim to have been, quote, harmed? Like emotionally harmed, physically harmed? It's weasel wordage.
There's also this part I have highlighted up here where it says the files relating to Epstein include a large volume of images and videos of victims who are either minors or appear to be minors, and over 10,000 download videos and images of illegal child sex abuse material and other pornography. And so that doesn't imply that he had 10,000 victims that he filmed. It's that he has a trove of child pornography.
Well, it's a bunch of I mean, you got to assume that memo was carefully worded. Like whoever wrote the memo, whether it was Pam Bondi or Kash Patel or their underlings, you got to think that there was some thought given to the precise wording of such a consequential memo. And the wording ultimately results in all these conflations and confusions around what's even being referred to.
But so there's there's all these norms and also legal restrictions around sex crimes and anonymity, especially when you're talking about minors. And then there's also the general, a lot of this bubbled up during the Me Too movement when there was a sort of imperative to be very credulous. Is your contention that a lot of that has made it much more difficult to get to the reality of the situation?
Yeah, for sure. Like it's even seen as somehow suspicious or disgusting to just examine the wording of that memo, right? I mean, they say illegal child exploitation material and pornography. Per current Department of Justice guidelines, no material that depicts a minor can be referred to any longer as pornography. So pornography in 2025 could only refer to materials that depict adults, and yet they kind of smush it together with the illegal child exploitation material, so it's difficult to distinguish what's even really being referred to. But in terms of Me Too and what relation it has to the Jeffrey Epstein case, yeah, I mean, one of the big ironies here is that we had a lot of people on the right become very fixated on the Epstein issue, right? While Biden was president, there were these memes that Kash Patel, for instance, was very integral in popularizing about how supposedly the Biden Department of Justice or the Biden FBI under Christopher Wray were concealing this shocking list of pedophiles. And according to Kash Patel, this is almost a verbatim quote, Christopher Wray, then the FBI director, should put on his big boy pants and tell us who the pedophiles are, because they assumed the idea was that these demonic Democrats were conspiring to conceal the truth about all their pedophilic friends who are implicated in all these crimes. But in so doing, in adopting the fervor that they did around this issue, the right ended up becoming like basically functional Me Too activists. Even today, even this week, I mean, after this rally or this press conference, if you look at a lot of like the right-wing coverage on social media and elsewhere, they just kind of credulously and instinctively just refer to these women who spoke as survivors or victims without any mind given at all to whether it's ever been credibly established that these people were victimized. No, almost none of them. Actually, I think zero. None of the victims, purportedly, who spoke yesterday have ever been adjudicated as victims in any kind of meaningful adversarial process.
So the reason people, one reason I imagine that people are wary of questioning someone who claims that they were sexually assaulted what is the motive? So what are the incentives to claim that you are one of the thousands of Epstein's victims?
Well, they have a couple of million motives, meaning dollar signs.
Mm-hmm.
This is never covered. It's astonishing. It's seen as offensive or unseemly to even discuss this whole element of the Jeffrey Epstein story, but it's absolutely critical. After Epstein died in August of 2019, there became available many millions of dollars that purported victims could access. So you had the Jeffrey Epstein estate, which is based in the Virgin Islands legally, that was being sued by a multitude of self-declared victims. And so what happened was the plaintiff's attorney, so David Boies, Bradley Edwards, who spoke at this rally yesterday or this press conference, and others in their little cohort, they collaborated with the lawyers representing Jeffrey Epstein's estate, Darren Indike and et al., to come up with a centralized mechanism to disperse settlement money so they wouldn't have to individually litigate each claim. And they modeled this on prior mediation schemes like the Jerry Sandusky payouts or the even the 9/11 payouts. So basically, there was a holistic solution where everybody could come to the same basically source to file their claim. And the way that this program is called the Epstein Victims Compensation Program was set up was that it guaranteed to any purported victim that they were entitled to a confidential and non-adversarial process to get up to $5 million, meaning there was no downside reputational risk if, let's say, they embellish their claims or dramatize them or factually fudge certain elements of their claims. So, for example, there would be every incentive to claim that you were as young as possible when you first encountered Epstein, because that would likely entitle you to much more money. But even adults were entitled to get millions of dollars from this claim. Being 18 or over, a legal adult, when you claim to have had sexual contact with Jeffrey Epstein, that was no barrier to filing a claim from the Epstein Victims Compensation Program. I've spoken to one actual, self-described victim who was a adult in her 20s when she claims to have been victimized by Epstein or, quote, trafficked. And she got, a huge settlement from this fund. So people think people think in the popular mind or the popular sort of conception is that these all must have been child victims, right? It's a pedophile ring. It's child sex trafficking. Mm-hmm. No, a huge percentage of these women were full-fledged adults who were basically engaged in, not to be crass, but transactional sexual sort of activity with an older, wealthy man that, by all accounts, they seem to engage in consensually to the extent you can do that. I don't know. I mean, if you're 22 and you consent to doing that, that's kind of what goes on. Yes. And even at this the press conference yesterday, alleged victim after alleged victim were women who were in their 20s when they encountered Epstein. But this all gets conflated and elided. And the general public, which of course doesn't have the bandwidth to really examine in great depth the details of this story, they just kind of lump it all together. And so actually do the politicians. I don't think Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie know a whole lot about the underlying details either, as much as I sort of appreciate them on other issue areas. They've just kind of latched onto this this issue, given the popular sort of outrage that arose after the DOJ FBI memo in early July. So it's a recurring problem.
We're trying to pull that all apart a little bit here and zero in on these cases that we are fairly certain happened, and then you need to get more and more skeptical the further sort of the more outrageous the claim is, or the kind of the higher profile the case becomes, and kind of later to the game that people get involved once these funds are set up. You have to take all those motives into account. I agree. But before we move on to sort of examine each the claims of what you call are the Epstein mythology.
Can I make one more point? Sorry, I lost my train of thought before. On the Maxwell trial.
Yeah, that's
just
why I wanted
the evidentiary problems.
We
were circling back to it. Good. Okay, good.
Problems as well. Could you finish that thread up?
You got to reel me in, because there are so many dimensions to all this that I could go on a million different tangents. In terms of the evidentiary problems with the Maxwell trial. Okay, so there was a victim. So remember, we have this universe. Oh, here's why I went on the tangent. We have the supposed universe of over 1,000 victims. Mm-hmm. People like Speaker Mike Johnson are going around saying, oh, this is so horrible. There are over 1,000 victims. They can't really give you any specificity as to what they're even referring to. But we're told that of this universe, allegedly, of over 1,000 victims, the government was able to produce 4 in the 2021 trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. They did not call to testify Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who we should get into, but basically was the progenitor of some of the more outlandish theories around Epstein and this massive pedophile ring and blackmail operation, et cetera. She was not called because she so grievously lacked in credibility that she would have destroyed the prosecution's case. She would have just been buried on cross-examination, and Maxwell likely could have been acquitted. But they did find 4 other people to call. One of them was somebody named Carolyn Adriano, who the claim was 14 when she first encountered Epstein and or Maxwell. The timeline gets hazy on this stuff. Mm-hmm. The corroborating evidence is a little hazy. There was some furnished by the government, but there are sort of gaps and ambiguities. But this is one of this is the 14-year-old who kind of people will point to saying, oh, look, there was a 14-year-old who was victimized, right? Okay, so in Carolyn Adriano's testimony, she volunteers the information to, I believe it was the defense counsel, it might have been the prosecution, but in any event, she volunteers information about her mental state. And she discloses that she's schizophrenic, that she hears voices, and these voices are telling her that her children, so she's in her 30s at this point, that her children are at risk of being abducted by sex traffickers. So she says she's a schizophrenic. And this is somebody who the jury is being asked to believe beyond a reasonable doubt can provide credible testimony about events that occurred 20 years or more before 2021. This is somebody whose testimony is supposed to be believed beyond a reasonable doubt in terms of establishing timelines, establishing chronology, establishing a nexus with Ghislaine Maxwell so she can be convicted of the trafficking crimes, right? Actually, one of the counts against Maxwell, she was actually acquitted on, and that related to this Carolyn Adriano accuser or victim or witness. So a schizophrenic Really? Of the over 1,000 purported victims that were told to exist, the government could only find somebody who was an avowed schizophrenic to convict Maxwell on these trafficking charges? That seems just totally bizarre.
Okay, but didn't
But you know what happened?
Just to be clear, you're saying that's the count that she was not convicted on.
She was convicted of other counts that pertained in some fashion to Carolyn Adriano, but there was one particular. So they heaped on a bunch of different counts, right? Some of which were pretty redundant. There was one count in terms of Carolyn Adriano's being sort of transported interstate to establish a trafficking foundation for a federal charge, because you have to. This is a federal case, right? Federal prosecution, and there has to be some, certain elements that are proven that show that it's within the proper remit of the federal government to charge a particular crime. So she was acquitted on one charge that related to the Carolyn Adriano claims, but she was convicted on others. And the strength of the evidence is incredibly lacking. By the end of the trial, actually, I forget exactly when it was over the course of the trial, but during the trial, the Judge Allison Nathan, who was otherwise preposterously pro-prosecution, like she allowed these two purported victims to testify under fake names, even though one of them had already come out in public with their real name, makes no sense, based on these sort of like fantastical allegations that she could be subjected to some kind of physical violence or threat or intimidation based on really no evidence at all. So this judge made ruling after ruling that was sort of absurdly pro-prosecution, because think of the political climate at the time. Sort of tail end of Me Too. We got to get somebody must be held responsible for this whole Jeffrey Epstein episode. He evaded justice by dying in prison before he had to face trial, etc. You had already like plenty of Netflix documentaries and lots of pop culture around Epstein and Maxwell. So somebody had to pay, right? So that was sort of the political climate. And when it comes to child sex trafficking, I mean, people just switch off their critical faculties entirely in a lot of cases. But even this extremely pro-prosecution judge found herself being compelled to instruct the jurors that of the 4 victims that the government called, purported victims that the government called, I would use scare quotes if I was writing this. Of the 4 alleged victims that the government called to testify, 2 of them must not be regarded by the jurors to have been subjected to any, quote, illegal sexual activity for the purposes of convicting Maxwell. All right, so of the over 1,000 victims we're told exist, the government finds 4, and then half of them have to be discarded in terms of having been subjected to any illegal sexual activity. You know why? Anushka DeGorgiou, who spoke, weepily at this rally yesterday, and is now and she's a multimillionaire. By the way, I think it was over $3 million she got just from one of the settlement funds alone from the Epstein estate, and then there were others available, like the J.P. Morgan mass multi-million-dollar settlement, Deutsche Bank. She was, weepily speaking at this rally yesterday, or this press conference yesterday, and she was talking about how she'd been silenced, etc. Well, what this extremely pro-prosecution judge found? That even at the time that she claimed that she first encountered Epstein and Maxwell in England, this is a British woman, she was actually sort of from a posh social milieu, that she was above the legal age of consent, even when she first met them in England, right? So in England, it's 16. So therefore, in terms of the jurisdiction that this initial meeting took place in, any sexual activity that may or may not have occurred couldn't even be regarded as illegal. And so, this woman was saying yesterday, I've been silenced for so long and I have these wounds that will never heal. I mean, I'm willing to subject myself to a wound that will entitle me to $3 million. Like, I think that would do a lot in terms of healing. I'm serious. I mean, it sounds crass or harsh, but like, so many of these women are just multi-millionaires now, and it's never pointed out. You talk about like, what could the incentive be to embellish or to dramatize a claim? I can't see a more straightforward objective. This other woman who was at this press conference yesterday, Annie Farmer, she also testified. She was one of the 4 who testified at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. She was one of the 2 whom the judge instructed jurors they were not to regard anything that she claimed happened to her as illegal sexual activity. And yet she's just always presented as this like minor victim of Epstein and or Maxwell. She's constantly on the media, on CNN and NBC News, et cetera, as a self-proclaimed survivor. She happens to be a licensed psychotherapist who specializes in trauma, so like critical trauma studies or something, and is sort of like the PR spokesperson for this whole like interpersonal social network of purported Epstein victims. And I actually tried to interview her yesterday. She wouldn't talk. She basically sicked her security goons on me. And, I was trying to be, I know I can be a little abrasive or maybe not the most warm and welcoming person to necessarily engage with, but, I'm not like a total idiot. So I tried to at least be cordial and normal. And, they don't want to talk. They don't want to answer any critical questions about anything at all. And yet this person is just like credulously put forward to the public by Thomas Massey and by Ro Khanna as yet another victim who's just at their press conference talking about what a victim she is. Okay, why not ask her how much money she got? We actually know how much she got because she was forced to disclose it at the Maxwell trial. I believe it was $1.5 million from that one settlement fund alone, and then others came afterwards, after 2021, that she would have been entitled to. So this woman is almost certainly and it's all tax-free. Multi-millionaire. I just think if you're so like blinkered with outrage that you can't even entertain how that could provide a perverse incentive, then what are we talking about? Isn't that just like the most obvious insight into human nature ever? Yeah. So yes, there is this huge structural incentive to make it so that anybody who can make even the most remote claim to be victimized in any conceivable respect would make the claim. I would make the claim. Zach, you would probably make the claim if it were available to you. You could just get several $1 million. And, oh, by the way, per the terms of this mediation structure, you don't have to make yourself public. You don't have to be cross-examined. And you'll get this secret, multi-million-dollar payment. Where do I sign up?
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't, but I take your point, and I think that there's I think by the same token that, yes, we should keep in mind these structural incentives, we should also not just assume that because someone got a payout, that means that they did it for the money. That's just a natural outcome of the legal system. And by the same token, because someone has schizophrenia doesn't mean that they weren't sexually abused. And in fact, the sexual abuse
that's not what I'm claiming.
The mental problems. I understand.
I'm claiming there's a beyond a reasonable doubt standard that the government must prove to throw somebody in prison for 20 years. Yeah. And if you're hinging your case on somebody who is an admitted schizophrenic hearing voices, that should reasonably impeach the veracity of that testimony.
I understand. And yes, I'm not familiar enough with the Maxwell trial to know if there was other evidence beyond
there was other
testimony that was convincing to the jury. But, so I feel like we've established the kind of 10% that you say is the true core of the Epstein case. And now I want to move on to what you call the Epstein mythology by examining a few of the specific claims. And the first claim is that Epstein was protected because he was an FBI informant or otherwise affiliated with the U.S. intelligence. And part of that seems to be based on this 2008 document. Let me share it. So this it's an FBI document describing Epstein providing information to the FBI as part of a non-prosecution agreement. And then, so what it says here is that with all conditions of his plea with the state of Florida, Epstein has also provided information to the FBI as agreed upon. And then that's often paired with this curious reaction from Alex Acosta, who's the former U.S. attorney and later Trump's labor secretary, who made that controversial deal with Epstein when he's asked directly by a reporter whether Epstein was connected to intelligence. Can you play that clip, John?
Richard Lardner from the Associated Press. Mr. Secretary, were you ever made aware at any point in your handling of this case if Mr. Epstein was an intelligence asset of some sort?
So there has been reporting to that effect, and let me say, there's been reporting to a lot of effects in this case, not just now but over the years, and again, I would hesitate to take this reporting as fact. This was a case that was brought by our office. It was brought based on the facts. And I look at that reporting and others. I can't address it directly because of our guidelines. But I can tell you that a lot of reporting is just going down rabbit holes. A few more questions.
Okay, so admittedly, kind of a weird and evasive response from Acosta there, right?
Perhaps you could say that, although I think it's pretty clear that he's denying the veracity of the media reports that have led people to suspect that Epstein was an intelligence asset of some kind. You mentioned that FBI informant claim.
He does not say that, though.
He doesn't say it directly. He's sort of appealing to DOJ guidelines where he can't get into the specifics, right? So it is a little bit of an evasion, but the DOJ evades questions all day, every day on that ground. But I'll grant that just to the naked eye or to the sort of casual viewer, that does appear to be a peculiar response. So no challenge for me on that necessarily. In terms of the FBI informant claim, my impression is that far more commonplace is the claim that Epstein was an intelligence asset. And it does draw partially from that Acosta response. And there's another quote that's attributed to Acosta that's essentially become like a central totem in the Epstein folklore. But just to address the FBI informant point briefly, I can't quite see it on the...
Yeah, it's this one, right, where he allegedly said, "I was told Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone." And it was from this, that was reported in this Daily Beast article by Vicky Ward in July of 2019. So these things are combining to create an impression that Acosta backed off because he was told by higher-ups that Epstein was part of an intelligence operation.
Right. Yes, that is the low information surmise that a lot of people make. Mm-hmm. That Vicky Ward article from July of 2019 has become so central to the mythology, it's kind of bizarre. And if you look at that article, right, it doesn't say anything about in the headline about Epstein being an intelligence asset, right? If this was the blockbuster evidence that Epstein was an intelligence asset, wouldn't you expect that to be foregrounded in the headline or in the lead? I mean, they buried the lead. They kind of throw it in a couple paragraphs in, essentially.
The headline for our audio-only listeners is "Jeffrey Epstein's sick story played out for years in plain sight."
Like if I had bombshell evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was an intelligence agent, I would have that reflected in my headline. So that's just a little strange, right? And, Vicky Ward has not been replying to my inquiries about this article. I don't know why. I don't know why she wouldn't be transparent about her journalistic craft. Seems a little strange. But we've seen a whole abundance of journalistic malfeasance around this story that's actually shocking.
So you simply don't believe quote, Acosta ever said that?
Well, you got to look at what is that quote? What is she purporting to report there? That she, Vicky Ward, was told 2 or 3 years before this article was published. So it was published in 2019. So this would have been a couple years prior to that, 2016 or 2017. Around the time that there was a Trump transition operation going on after Trump won the 2016 election. So that's July 2019. When would that have been? Like late 2016 or something? Mm-hmm. And so she's saying that 2 or 3 years before she publishes this article, she had been told by an anonymous former senior Trump White House official that Acosta had
a member of the
said,
Trump transition team. Yeah.
Right. That Acosta had said that he had been told that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, and therefore, I think Vicky Ward says Acosta was told to back off. So it's like triple or quadruple hearsay, right? It has never been corroborated anywhere else. Vicky Ward, to my knowledge, hasn't done any major real follow-up journalistically on this seemingly sensational claim. She is a little bit cagey about explaining some of the sourcing. I can't say with absolute certainty that the anonymous former senior White House official that she's attributing this to is Steve Bannon. But it is true that Steve Bannon, around this very same time period, meaning 2 or 3 years before July of 2019, was essentially collaborating with Vicky Ward on a book, trashing the Kushners. Remember, that was Bannon's mortal nemesis in the first Trump administration. And Bannon has also said stuff to this effect in other venues. So there's a book by Michael Wolff, the journalist, who knew Bannon, knew Epstein, and kind of connected the two and was present when they were meeting with one another. Bannon actually ended up filming 15 or 16 hours of interview footage with Jeffrey Epstein as like a media prep session, because the idea was Bannon was going to be enlisted to help rehabilitate, if you can believe it, Jeffrey Epstein's image after the Miami Herald published a series of articles by Julie K. Brown in November of 2018 that kind of harnessed the power of Me Too, essentially, as Julie K. Brown puts it, to breathe new life into the Jeffrey Epstein story and actually catalyze federal prosecutors to re-prosecute Epstein. But Bannon's like conferring with Epstein around this time. And if you read Michael Wolff's book, it's called Too Rich, I think. I might be misremembering the title, but it's a 2021 book. Wolff quotes, he has he does have recordings of Epstein and Bannon sort of liaising with one another. And he quotes Bannon as basically kind of aimlessly speculating that Jeffrey Epstein seems like a guy who was connected to intelligence. We just don't know who. So we know that Bannon has trafficked in this speculation. We know he's a gossip. We know he loves chatting it up with the media. Although, even despite my having spoken to him in the past, he does not want to talk to me about his 15 or 16 hours of Jeffrey Epstein interview footage that he's been concealing since 2019. So go figure.
Do you have any insight on that? Why did he do this? Why would he make what seemingly, if this reporting is right, was meant to rehabilitate a documentary meant to rehabilitate Jeffrey Epstein's image, and then just sit on the material while simultaneously stoking rumors about him being an intelligence agent?
Well, the initial purpose of it wouldn't have been to produce a documentary. That was Bannon's post hoc excuse years later. This phantom documentary that somehow never comes out. He claimed that he was going to be putting out in 2021, and then he claimed it again recently. He said, okay, just wait 9 months till next year. Maybe I'll put out this alleged documentary. But the purpose at the time, if Michael Wolff's reporting is to be believed, and, Michael Wolff maybe have some issues in terms of his methodology, but he does have, we know that he has actual audio recordings that he's quoting directly from. And he was present, physically present, for these Bannon-Epstein meetings. And so the idea was not that Bannon was going to come and make a documentary on Jeffrey Epstein, is that he was going to give him media training so that Epstein could do an interview with the likes of 60 Minutes or Gayle King, and he could rehabilitate his image. Epstein also tried to hire PR firms that could help him. This is late 2018, early 2019. No PR firm in the United States that he could find wanted to sign up and agree to attempt to rehabilitate him. He eventually found a British firm.
Steve Bannon? That's
just
so strange.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems strange, but if you think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, Bannon was seen as a political Svengali, rightly or wrongly, who powered Trump to his improbable victory in 2016. So he was in high demand around the world. Different political parties in Europe and elsewhere, I'm sure different corporations who wanted his consulting services as a communications professional or something, right? And he had recently served as a senior White House official in the Trump administration until August of 2017, which is why, if it is him that Vicky Ward is attributing this quote to, That would have been a correct way to describe him, a former Trump White House official.
He's just being like super mercenary about it. Then.
Yeah, and also, I think he probably was fascinated on some level with Epstein.
Yeah.
Wolf quotes Bannon as telling Epstein, like, semi-jokingly, "You were the one guy I was afraid of during the 2016 election," meaning Epstein was the one guy who might have actually had the goods on Trump or could have put out some information that might have been politically damaging to Trump. Trump otherwise was Teflon, right? The Access Hollywood tape, other women making other kinds of allegations against him. Bannon, like seemingly semi-jokingly, so there might have been a kernel of truth to it, says to Epstein, "You were the one guy who I was afraid of," right? So maybe he kind of wanted to sort of see what Epstein's deal was in relation to that. We don't know if they had a business relationship. Bannon won't talk about it. So we don't know, was Bannon ever contacted by the FBI in relation to his possession of this interview footage? You would think, right? Because Epstein was being vigorously investigated by the FBI around this time. And if Bannon had potential evidence, it makes all the sense in the world that he would have been approached by the FBI. But he's very tight-lipped about it.
I don't want to lose the thread of Acosta, though, which you have serious doubts that anything Acosta has said there links Epstein to intelligence because of things he's said elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I have serious doubts that the provenance of that quote can be seen as automatically credible. It's like, it would never be admissible in court. Not that that's the standard in journalism necessarily, but it's like triple or quadruple hearsay or something, never corroborated anywhere else that we know of, never meaningfully followed up on by Vicky Ward that I'm aware of. And like weirdly buried in that article, and yet it became like this central facet of the popular sort of online mythology around Epstein. But and what's always excluded, curiously enough, from these people who are so feverish in their promotion of these intelligence theories, and look, I'm in favor, let's do all the investigation that anybody could ever possibly want on Jeffrey Epstein, journalistically, legally, or otherwise. I'm for maximum disclosure. I'm all in favor of producing all the Epstein files. I don't think people realize that the central reason why so many Epstein quote-unquote files have been concealed is by judicial order or because of federal statutes that supposedly are meant to protect the privacy interests of purported victims. So if you really want Epstein files released, please go and petition the Southern District of New York or the Southern District of Florida and tell them that the purported privacy interests of alleged victims should be overridden by the extreme public interest in this story, so we shouldn't worry about identifying information about victims because there's a public interest that supersedes it in putting out the information. I agree with that. Weirdly, the people who demand maximum disclosure don't seem to agree with that, so there seems to be a contradiction there. But yeah, seldom is it ever mentioned until I read this report, right? It's that there's directly contradictory evidence in terms of what Alex Acosta said as to his experiences with Jeffrey Epstein. The only time that it's known that Alex Acosta was ever asked to address directly under oath and under penalty of perjury whether he had knowledge that Jeffrey Epstein was a, quote, intelligence asset, it was in this November 2020 Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility report that very few of these online Epstein quote-unquote researchers seem to have read. They seem to more research things like Pizzagate or what have you, and we can get into specifics if you're interested, because there's a big media scandal here too that I think is worth discussing. But there's a section of this report, which is the report itself as a whole is extremely illuminating. If people are legitimately interested in the factual record around this story, what went into the brokering of the 2007-2008 federal non-prosecution agreement in Florida that then gave rise to Epstein pleading guilty to 2 state-level charges in Florida. But toward the end of this report, they're kind of tying up loose ends, and they quote, the matter is put to Acosta, according to a footnote, as to whether he had knowledge that Epstein was an intelligence asset, and he says, quote, the answer is no. And this is under penalty of perjury and under oath. Does it mean that he's telling the full truth?
Because I've got that pulled up on the screen right now. And by the way, we're linking all of this material in the description of the episode. And of course, Michael also has it at his Substack. When this is footnote 244. When OPR asked Acosta about his apparent equivocation during his 2019 press conference, which we just played, in answering a media question about whether he had knowledge of Epstein being an intelligence asset, Acosta stated to OPR that the answer is no, and he was made aware that they could use a classified setting to discuss intelligence information, which I guess implies that he could have gone into a secure location to disclose that if he wanted to, but declined to do so. I also want to read this one from earlier in the report. Media reports in mid-2009 suggested Epstein was released from his state incarceration early because he was assisting in financial crimes investigation in the Eastern District of New York involving his former employer, Bear Stearns. One of the lead investigators said to her colleagues that this is an urban myth. The FBI and I looked into this and do not believe any of it is true. Acosta told OPR that he did not have any information about Epstein cooperating in a financial investigation. So that this is just, we want everyone to see, both the Acosta equivocation, but then also, as you're saying, under oath, saying no.
Yeah, so this doesn't mean that it's 100% dispositively proven that Jeffrey Epstein was not an intelligence asset, or that it's 100% eternally certain that Acosta never claims that Epstein was an intelligence asset. All I've ever been trying to relay when I cite this quote from this report is that there's directly countervailing evidence in the public record that's been in the public record for almost 5 years that is just totally omitted from like the popular clamor, particularly on the internet, around Epstein's purported ties to intelligence agencies. A lot of people seem especially convinced that he was tied to Israeli intelligence agencies. It is true that he had this relationship with Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister. And that's certainly worth exploring. I mean, I'm now, to my own detriment, maybe perpetually fascinated with everything Jeffrey Epstein. So I want to know as much information as possible. But if you're going to use that like triple or quadruple hearsay quote from that was buried in a random Daily Beast article 6 years ago, but you're going to neglect to ever even mention, or you have no awareness of, this directly contradictory quote from a DOJ report where Acosta could, in theory, be charged with perjury and have his career ruined if he were to lie in, that causes me to question the sincerity of the research that so many of these people do, or the sincerity of the investigation that they claim that they're so desperate to have undertaken, right? They have a premise that they've already established that they then want to like backfill because they're tantalized by these more sort of grandiose theories around Epstein and are kind of picking and choosing evidence to bolster those theories. They don't take any kind of an impartial outlook on any of this. Otherwise, presumably, so many of these researchers and people would have known. So I will name a few names. People like Whitney Webb. The entire internet is obsessed with this person as some kind of like leading journalistic authority on Jeffrey Epstein. Daryl Cooper, a.k.a. Martyr Maid, another person who's hailed as like one of the national experts and authorities in the, quote, Epstein space, as he calls it. Other people of this sort of ilk, I was being constantly bombarded with demands that I engage with their work and so forth. Turns out Whitney Webb admitted to me over email as of last month, after having supposedly been like a 24/7 professional Epstein chronicler in terms of his intelligence ties since 2019. She admitted to me that she didn't even know this Department of Justice report existed until I emailed her. Michael Tracey emailed her in August of 2025. Now, just to be clear, I'm not denying wholesale that Epstein could have never interfaced with anybody who was associated with any intelligence agency. Just by virtue of his association with Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, he was associated, in terms of business relationships, business relations and personal relations, with somebody who would have been the head of the Mossad at one point while he was prime minister. Just by virtue of him providing his private plane to Bill Clinton to fly around on in 2002 in 2003 to attend Clinton Foundation events in Africa and whatnot, he clearly would have had, had very close proximity to the highest echelons of American and Israeli political power. So no doubt about that. But then people want to make this like unfounded logical leap to, therefore, he was orchestrating a child sex trafficking ring at the behest of some intelligence agency to ensnare these prominent people and then blackmail them, and then that's really where his money came from, or something like this. It's always this like, ridiculously far-fetched surmise that people want to make that really is not grounded in the available facts or evidence.
Yeah, I think also one of the reasons people jump to the intelligence connection is his relationship with Maxwell, whose father was not a known Mossad agent, but was certainly very well connected in the Israeli government. I mean, you read about his funeral, and like every important person in the Israeli state was there and saying things about all the contributions he made. So I think that raised alarm bells for people. I'm not saying that therefore you can make that logical leap, because Ghislaine, in the report we talked about earlier, claims that Epstein never even met her father. But I want to return to Whitney Webb in a minute, because I want to talk about.
Can I do a quick point on Robert Maxwell, or was that too far afield? Because I know it's hard to remain structured here.
Yeah, just briefly.
Okay, quick point. So yes, it's true. Robert Maxwell was a benefactor of the Israeli state. It's pretty well established, or was sort of revealed after his death. His own children, meaning the living children of Robert Maxwell, including Ghislaine, who's the youngest daughter, but their other siblings, they say that they hadn't really been aware of this until after Maxwell's death in 1991, I believe. But it's pretty well established that in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, he had some connection whereby he was instrumental in funneling arms from Czechoslovakia, as it was called at the time, to Israel to fight essentially the Arabs and what the Israelis call their War of Independence. The Arabs have a different name for it. They call it the Palestinians call it the Nakba, etc. So yeah, that's pretty well established. And then he was clearly also a wealthy man who supported Israel and had a lot of money and funded, or probably donated. I don't actually know this for sure, but it seems probable that he donated to pro-Israel or Jewish causes that are welcomed by Israel. And then, yes, when he dies, he's buried in the Mount of Olives in annexed East Jerusalem for this honorary burial where non-Israelis who are seen as great, beneficent friends of the Israeli state are sometimes given honorary burials. Sheldon Adelson, when he died in 2021, the biggest Republican donor at the time, who was also ardently pro-Israel, his corpse was flown from Malibu, California, to the Mount of Olives for a ceremonial burial. So yes, this is true, but I think people, again, it's this another sort of specious logical leap that people want to make without bothering to fill in the evidentiary gaps. Okay, because Ghislaine Maxwell's father was buried at the Mount of Olives, therefore what? That establishes that Jeffrey Epstein was running a pedophile ring for Israel? Like, I'm sorry, maybe we all need to take a remedial logic class, or I don't know what we need to do, but we all need to get a little bit more rational in our synthesis and processing of information to know how to determine when certain claims have an adequate factual basis for us to just spout off on the internet. Although, that's the losing battle in terms of the internet.
Okay, so I think that one issue here is that there are many anomalies that jump out at people, and that there are things that just don't make sense. To return to Acosta for a moment, just the mere fact that Epstein got this non-prosecution agreement, that he served less time than the guy who stole his contact book and then tried to sell it. That doesn't make sense to people. It's just like, why would Acosta make this deal? And then he offers these weird answers about, intelligence. There's this quote, and at least there's there's some sort of logic to that. Why do you think Acosta would make a deal like this?
Yeah. So in that now fabled or folkloric quote of Acosta, the triple hearsay quote, Vicky Ward, I think, uses her own language and says that Acosta was told to back off because he was told that Epstein belonged to intelligence. But there's a fallacy there. And this is another huge misconception. I would really implore, if people are genuinely interested, please take some time to read the whole 350-page Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility report that we were referencing earlier, published in November of 2020, because it goes through all of this in incredibly meticulous, almost even sometimes maybe superfluous detail, because it's so comprehensive. There's a fallacy that Acosta ever, quote, backed off. I mean, that's not what happened. Acosta oversaw the federal intercession into what had been, up to that point, a state-level prosecution. It was being handled, of Epstein. It was being handled by the Palm Beach County District Attorney. So it would have been in the purview of the state of Florida. And like I mentioned earlier, Epstein had been indicted by a grand jury on that felony solicitation of prostitution charges. But the local police detective, his name was Joe Riccari. He's seen as some kind of like heroic martyr figure almost in some of these like popular media depictions of the Epstein case, like on Netflix. I mean, these documentaries are just absurd, but so many people consume them, and then it just like forms their entire perception of everything Epstein, because nobody's going to read the documents, right? I mean, why would they? It's better to just flip on Netflix and kind of like, space out. So Acosta then undertakes a federal intercession into what had been a state-level prosecution. And Epstein's defense counsel, and he did have the resources, no doubt about it, to have extremely high-powered, politically influential, aggressive defense counsel representing him. So Alan Dershowitz, Ken Starr was brought in to make federalism arguments. I'll get to that in a minute. Jay Lefkowitz, another Republican who had influence at the time in the George W. Bush administration. Roy Black, one of the most famous, basically, criminal defense attorneys in the Miami area, and others. I mean, money was of no issue for Epstein in terms of who he could hire to represent him. So they pulled out every trick in the book in terms of what they could conjure to potentially get Epstein the most advantageous possible resolution to this matter that arose in 2005 when there was this local police investigation into his conduct with these teenage girls, more or less. Again, whether they're just above or just below or in that age range of the age of consent, they want to get a resolution to that whole matter. He did have very aggressive defense attorneys who were among the most notable lawyers in the country agitating on his behalf or advocating on his behalf.
So one version of this Epstein story then is that it's the classic two justice systems, one for the wealthy and one for the rest of us, because the wealthy can afford to hire these attorneys who then intimidate the government from pursuing the kind of case they would against just about anybody else for these kinds of crimes.
I don't think that's quite right. I think it's a little too glib. I'm not saying you're being glib, but like somebody who would make that case or make that argument or make that sort of summarization of things, I think it's being a little too glib. Because, first of all, in general, when people say, oh, because this wealthy person had very well-resourced and aggressive and skillful defense counsel, that shows that there's a two-tier system of justice or something. And of course it is true. The more means you have, the more ability that you have to hire skilled practitioners of the law to represent you. But I don't like how that sort of gets spun, meaning my ideal would be that everybody could have the means, if they're accused of a crime by the government, to have the best possible representation. Not that it's somehow intrinsically bad or suspicious or condemnable for somebody who happens to be wealthy to avail himself of that very effective representation. I also don't think it's quite true that they threatened, they intimidated the government.
Michael, I'm just saying that for most Americans, thinking if I hired underage girls to come in and, do sexual things on a massage table, I would be going to prison. I mean, people go to prison for, having files on their computer that depict this kind of stuff, and he was actually doing it and got away pretty easily, all things considered. And I think for most people that indicates there's something wrong here, something rotten, and they're looking for an answer.
Again, I don't think that's quite right, because you have to understand what the issues were in that Palm Beach prosecution and what then led to the federal intercession. And this is also detailed in part in that Department of Justice report, but it's also detailed in much of the investigatory materials that have been released in Florida pursuant to that legislation that was signed by DeSantis that I mentioned earlier. So this is all available for people to peruse if they'd like. But there were major evidentiary problems which would have complicated, to say the least, the ability to prosecute Epstein. Because, for instance, there were purported victims who had been preliminarily designated by the federal government as victims when they first interceded, right? And they were trying to survey for which victims might be in existence. There were purported victims who the government had sent like something called a victim notification letter, which is a whole strange due process violating issue that we could maybe get into another time. But in other words, the federal government sent this letter notifying this person that they alleged was a victim, that they were a victim and that they were entitled to like this or that relief in terms of the ongoing prosecution of Epstein. And a recipient of that letter, who was told she was a victim, denied that she was a victim, denied that she had been victimized by Epstein. There were other purported victims who did not want Epstein to be prosecuted. There were some purported victims who wanted to not just not prosecute Epstein, they wanted to prosecute other victims, quote unquote. So other teenage girls, right? Because they were saying it's not Jeffrey's fault that X, Y, or Z happened. It's this other girl who maybe had told us to lie about our ages, told us to say we were 18, told us to essentially lie to Epstein. Some of them had a fake ID. Again, please, people don't misconstrue me. I'm not saying this to condone Epstein's conduct. I'm just trying to give you some insight into what the evidentiary hurdles were in the Palm Beach prosecution. So this idea that it would have just been so straightforward just to put the guy away forever when he had some of the most high-powered attorneys who could have taken the case to trial, could have impeached a ton of witnesses, could have shown that the government had misidentified purported victims. Some of these people, some of these purported victims did change their stories a lot, right? The initial, there was a 14-year-old who sort of who launched the criminal investigation of Jeffrey Epstein to begin with in 2005, right? What happened was there was a 14-year-old who had gone to Epstein's house once, recruited or enticed to go or asked to go by another teenage girl who was slightly older but was like in her social milieu, let's say. And it was all centered, much of it was centered around this one particular high school in the Palm Beach area. As that happens in high school, like rumors start to fly, people are gossiping, and this girl gets in a fight with another girl who's trying to embarrass her over having gone to this. It's not clear that she really even engaged in a sexual act. This girl has been interviewed many times, so you can find the records. It seems, she, was sort of asked, she was told basically to misrepresent her age. I'm not sure if Epstein actually asked her age, but either way, like the thinking was among these girls that, like, we want to go to the house of this rich guy in Palm Beach to get $200 cash to give this massage type thing or participate in this massage exercise, and then we can go to the mall afterwards. This is not me trying to be derogatory at all toward the girls. This is in the public record in terms of what they said, how they described what they were doing. And so the girl this 14-year-old gets in a fight with another girl at the high school. She gets called in essentially the principal's office or to the guidance counselor or something. The mother gets told. The mother then confronts the daughter, hey, what are you up to? She doesn't want to say. And finally it's pried out of her, and then the mother goes to the police. But sometimes it's kind of wrongly portrayed as though this traumatized 14-year-old went desperately to her mother and said, you have to help me. No, the 14-year-old, by all available evidence that I'm aware of, was desperate to conceal it from her mother, which you could see as sort of plausible in terms of like what a 14-year-old who is maybe like up to something that they don't want their mother to know about, how they would be thinking about this kind of situation. So, but that 14-year-old gave many conflicting stories. Now, I'm not saying anybody has to be a perfect victim, or that because there were conflicting or contradictory stories that were told by this 14-year-old, that means like nothing could have happened to her. I'm just saying that in terms of the strength of the evidence, there were serious complicating factors. Mm-hmm. And that then gave rise to the Palm Beach District Attorney choosing to impanel a grand jury. And the grand jury, if you go read the transcripts of the grand jury proceedings, which usually aren't available to the public, but because of the unusual outsized focus or interest on this Epstein case, again, there was that sort of exceptional law that was signed in Florida. The grand jurors are incredibly skeptical of these girls/women. Like there are female grand jurors who are kind of like reprimanding the girls, like you knew what you were doing, that sort of thing. Now you could object, maybe that was culturally wrong or so morally wrong, whatever. I'm just telling you, I'm just giving you what the
you're just saying there's an alternative explanation as to why this deal was made versus
and here's the other thing, and then another thing,
some sort of connections, or that he was just way too stacked wealthy.
And just to tie up that point really briefly. So when the feds interceded, right, Acosta interceded, they didn't want to take it to trial. They wanted to compel or even coerce Epstein to agree to a plea, right? So they came up with this non-prosecution agreement where Epstein had to plead to a secondary charge that was a state charge that was more severe than he would have been subjected to if this had just been left to the Palm Beach District Attorney. And if this had just been left to the Palm Beach District Attorney, Epstein wouldn't have had to plead guilty to a charge that, for example, would have required him to register for life as a sex offender, would have required him to come up with a sort of scheme to pay out monetary damages civilly to certain government-identified victims, and also he wouldn't have been required to serve any term of incarceration at all. So because of this federal intercession by Acosta, where they succeeded in compelling him to plead guilty rather than taking it to trial, because the feds, if you look at their internal communications at the time in Acosta's office, they were worried that given these evidentiary problems and also given some of the legal problems around federalism, like Ken Starr was brought in to make federalism arguments to the Republican Department of Justice senior leadership saying, look, you guys haven't established that this federal intercession by Acosta is even valid because there's no interstate nexus. This is not about interstate commerce, right? You're superseding the state of Florida. We're all Republicans here. We're all states' rights people. This is an unjustified intrusion by the federal government on the sovereignty of Florida. This was the argument that Ken Starr was making, and he didn't succeed. The senior leadership of the DOJ allowed this federal intercession by Acosta to go forward. Acosta didn't want to go to trial because of the evidentiary and legal problems, and he succeeded in compelling Epstein to finally plead guilty per the terms of the non-prosecution agreement. And Epstein got a much more onerous sentence that he ever would have gotten if they had just left it to the devices of the state. So I think people really have severe misconceptions around this stuff. Epstein, was really enraged more or less at his defense attorneys. Like he fired Alan Dershowitz, they fell out. He thought he got a terrible deal. He thought that the infractions, the sexual infractions were of so minor that it really should have been able to be disposed of in a much more conciliatory way. Whether that's true, I'm not sure, but it was a bizarre situation where the feds were claiming they had jurisdiction over something that, like, prior to that point, they would not have been popularly seen or widely seen to have jurisdiction over because there was no involvement with the internet, so they couldn't invoke that in terms of why there were federal statutes that provided for if there's if the internet is used to engage in essentially prostitution or quote unquote trafficking of minors, then it could be a federal crime, et cetera. So Epstein, in other words, Acosta did not back off in the way people think he must have because he was so intimidated by Epstein's purported ties to intelligence. Rather, it was only due to this federal intercession that Epstein got any meaningful punishment at all. And, for example, had to register for life as a sex offender, which Epstein really didn't want to do. It's a big pain in the ass. You have to determine what are you required to report in each jurisdiction because they all differ in terms of states, the U.S. Virgin Islands, et cetera. So again, I think it's a big misconception that people think, oh, he just got away with it or whatever. It's just not. It's just like that's not. That does not align with the facts.
Okay, let me bring us to another claim, which is that Epstein wasn't just keeping some underage harem for himself or getting these massages for himself, but was providing girls to famous people like Prince Andrew. And of course, there's this famous picture, which I'll share to remind everyone. Here we go. Of Prince Andrew, Virginia Giuffre, and she's supposed to be 17 years old there. And there's Maxwell in the background. Right. Now, interestingly, Maxwell claims that this is a fake picture. She claimed that in that proffer that we were talking about earlier. And Prince Andrew himself has also implied that in this clip we're about to play. Could you roll that, John?
She described meeting you. She was a 17-year-old girl meeting a senior member of the royal family.
Never happened.
She provided a photo of the two of you together.
Yes.
Your arm was around her waist.
Yes.
You've seen the photo.
I've seen the photograph.
How do you explain that?
I can't. Because I have absolutely no memory of that photograph ever being taken.
Do you recognize yourself in the photo?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult not to recognize yourself.
Your friend suggested that the photo is fake.
I think it's from the investigations that we've done, you can't prove whether or not that photograph is faked or not.
So yeah.
Do you actually think that this is a fake photo?
Well, that Prince Andrew interview. So that was a BBC interview with Emily Maitlis in 2019 that caused a huge sensation, right? It was a PR nightmare for Prince Andrew. He did come across as somewhat odd in that interview. It was not customary for senior level members of the British royal family to sit for adversarial interviews of any kind. And so he did not come across as particularly persuasive to much of the viewing public in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. But he's not as outlandish in much of what he says as I think a lot of people reflexively assumed. So I can't say one way or another whether that photo is authentic. I just know that Maxwell, Prince Andrew, and others that I've actually spoken to have some degree of involvement with this case do provide a non-crazy theory as to this photo not being authentic. It's a photo of a photo, essentially, they say. The proportions of the bodies, essentially, in that location, they say, are a bit askew or off. There's this woman named Lady Victoria Hervey, who's basically an English socialite. She had either dated or been a social acquaintance of Prince Andrew decades ago, and is one of his few public advocates in England, because Prince Andrew is essentially persona non grata over this whole affair. But she at one point posed as a buyer to who was interested in purchasing this house, meaning Ghislaine Maxwell's former house in Belgravia, London. And she took independent photos of that area of the house where this infamous Virginia Roberts Giuffre photo was purportedly taken in 2001. And the dimensions of it are a little curious. I mean, it's not quite clear if the proportions totally line up, but you know what? for our purposes, let's just stipulate that it is an authentic photo.
But
it's not even that relevant.
I mean, this is the tough thing about the situation we're in now is that, I mean, this was before AI, so it would be even worse now. But, you know, obviously manipulation of photos is possible. But then we've also seen people in power use the fact that this technological ability exists to lie. I mean, I keep thinking back to the Biden cheap fakes moment where, you know, Biden's like collapsing and they're like, oh, these videos are all cheap fakes of Biden, by which they meant just sort of edited in a way they didn't like, but trying to evoke the fear of AI deep fakes. I think that is a definite possibility going on here, but proceed as if this is an authentic photo, as you were saying.
Yeah. So even if we stipulate that it's an authentic photo, it's sort of immaterial, I would argue. By the way, what's really egregious about that 2019 BBC interview, and I've been meaning to write something about this, maybe I will soon, is that if you go and watch that whole interview by Emily Maitlis, it's essentially her serving as a proxy for Virginia Roberts Giuffre. She's asking Prince Andrew questions as though she's basically a stand-in for Virginia Roberts Giuffre, or more relevantly or accurately, her lawyer, Bradley Edwards, who was the one orchestrating this press conference yesterday in front of the Capitol. And I don't know if we're going to get into my experience there at the press conference. Okay, but yeah, so I'll bracket the Bradley Edwards side of all this for now. But it's basically, you know, it's presented as this adversarial, tough interview, but it's basically just Emily Maitlis aping this plaintiff's attorney. It's aping this woman, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who's like probably one of the least credible people to have ever walked the earth. And so it was a horrible interview. I mean, it was actually a shameful interview. And I don't say this as anybody who has any particular brief for the royal family, but it was so, I think, disingenuously conducted, because it was just told as though it was the same interview that would have been conducted more or less if Bradley Edwards, the lawyer of Virginia Roberts Giuffre, was conducting the journalistic interview, because they were just trying to extract whatever little data points they could from Prince Andrew to supposedly corroborate what Virginia Roberts Giuffre had alleged, because nobody else made any claims against, nobody else in this universe of like over 1,000 Epstein victims, allegedly, made any claim about Prince Andrew. It was only Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who we should get into more.
But at the end of the day, they paid her, I believe, $16 million. Why would they do that if there was nothing?
Okay, yeah, right. So let's rewind a little bit. In 2011, the Daily Mail publishes that now infamous photo of Virginia Roberts purportedly with Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell. Virginia Roberts Giuffre is paid $160,000 by the UK Daily Mail, the British tabloid, to publish that photo or to provide that photo and also to do an interview. And I don't know about you, but I actually remember this article at the time in 2011. I didn't give it that much thought, frankly, at the time, but I do remember it. And Virginia Roberts Giuffre was paid $160,000 for it. This woman will become very wealthy by the end of her life, which, of course, we're also not allowed to know, because that's like impugning a victim, or it's just really mean and nasty to talk about the fact that this woman was fabulously wealthy, had oceanside mansions, had a lavish ranch that she was able to purchase with the ultimate Prince Andrew settlement money in Australia, living a life of luxury. You know, so if you are mad that I pointed out that fact, I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, in 2011, she gets this $160,000 for that Daily Mail article, and then giving over the photo. And then she begins to scheme, essentially, with the Daily Mail journalist, Sharon Churcher, about how they can capitalize on the splash that article made, because it did make a big splash at the time, and they wanted to keep it going. They wanted to keep the momentum going, right? So they're sort of strategizing. How can we get a book deal? How can we even maybe get a movie deal, right? And so she and Sharon Churcher, the Daily Mail journalist, are again, you know, sort of strategizing amongst themselves. And these are emails that came out in discovery and litigation. Please, no one take my word for any of this. I will send you the primary source material if you'd like. Just contact me. And they basically decided like a great way for them to entice potential book publishers or even like entertainment representatives who would want to dramatize Virginia Roberts Giuffre's story is to just throw in a bunch of random names of prominent men into a book proposal and or a book memoir manuscript, because what will happen? They'll, the prospective literary agent or something would say, oh, gee whiz, Bill Clinton. Oh, gee whiz, Prince Andrew. You know why I won't grant with any certainty that the Prince Andrew photo is real? Is because this woman has such a demonstrable track record of just chronic fabrications that you would have to be an idiot to take a single thing she ever said or did at face value without additional corroborating evidence. So you cannot take anything just at face value or as true just based on her word alone. It would have to be substantiated by additional independent corroborating evidence.
If she's such a bullshitter, why pay her $16 million?
I got you. So it's a good question. So she, in December of 2014, so just before New Year's Eve, Bradley Edwards, the guy at the Capitol yesterday, along with another lawyer, Paul Cassell, file a motion on behalf of Virginia Roberts Giuffre. They file it's called a motion for joinder. The idea was that they wanted to petition the court to allow Virginia Roberts Giuffre to join this ongoing litigation around supposed violations of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And the claim was that the government-identified victims had not been given sufficient advance notice of the government's negotiation of this non-prosecution agreement in Florida. And there was this 2004 statute that was signed into law by George W. Bush that was promoted by this Senator John Kyle of Arizona, who was like a hardcore, tough on crime, didn't really care about civil liberties type Republican who styled himself as supporting the rights of victims, right? And that's how this law comes about. Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell want Virginia Roberts Giuffre to be able to join this ongoing litigation that was initiated by other purported victims, right? So in that motion for joinder, she introduces essentially what would later come to be understood as the widely believed Epstein mythology, which is that she specifically accuses Alan Dershowitz of having been someone that she had been sex trafficked to as a minor. She specifically accuses Prince Andrew, but then she also accuses a whole generic other category of prominent people who she doesn't specify, like foreign princes, foreign prime ministers, etc. She's just claiming that she's been trafficked to this generic category of people. Edwards, on behalf of Giuffre, sued Dershowitz for defamation because Dershowitz came out immediately and said, the people who filed this motion for joinder are lying. I never met this woman. I never had sex with her. I've only had sex with my wife since, in this relevant time period, etc. And so it snowballed this litigation, and it culminated 8 years later in 2022 when finally a resolution was reached whereby Bradley Edwards and also David Boies, the other high-power lawyer who was in their little cohort, they have to admit that she falsely accused Alan Dershowitz. Now, they phrase the language of this joint statement that they put out in a way where there's maybe some plausible deniability, but there functionally isn't. It's worded as, this is November 2022, Virginia Roberts Giuffre now recognized that she may have made a mistake in identifying Dershowitz as the individual to whom she had claimed for nearly a decade she had been sex trafficked as a minor. Now, if you go and look about how she tried to substantiate these claims that she had been making under deposition, she describes in illicit, graphic, lurid detail each individual instance of her being purportedly sexually victimized as a minor by Dershowitz.
I guess
this is a family podcast, so I won't get into it. But it's like she talks about how he ejaculated in this stuff, and then she recants it. So I'm sorry, if that's not fatal to someone's credibility, then what is? And there's a million other things I can give you that just bury her credibility completely.
I understand. I would expect, I guess the expectation that one might have is that if you were innocent, you would act like Alan Dershowitz and fight it off and win.
Right.
But what Alan Dershowitz has admitted to is getting massages in Epstein's house, but he says total.
I think he admits to getting one massage from an adult, and he didn't enjoy it.
Yes, I think he said a 40-plus-year-old Russian woman in the Palm Springs house, Palm
Beach.
Yeah. Sorry, not West Palm House, not Palm Springs. But then, on the other hand, Prince Andrew paid the royal family paid $16 million to just make it go away. It's not evidence
but
that
think
he did
about the
anything
peculiarities.
Wrong, but it is.
So in the settlement, they admit to there's no admission made of wrongdoing. But yes, it does come across to the public as potential evidence that there was something to the allegations, right? Because otherwise, why would you pay? Well, there are some explicable reasons why that settlement might have been done that are related to like the peculiarities of the British royal family. So Prince Andrew wouldn't have been fully in charge of his own finances, right? The British royal family has extremely opaque finances. It's not as though he could just open up his checkbook necessarily and decide to pay for extended litigation. Also, David Boies and Edwards and et al. Filed finally this lawsuit against Prince Andrew in a way that was strategically timed. So the initial allegation of sexual misconduct by Andrew was in 2014. It wasn't until 2021 that, in August of 2021, that the individualized lawsuit is finally filed by Boies and Edwards against Prince Andrew. And so why the delay? Well, some interesting things were going on at the time. New York State had passed a law, which I still am shocked was never challenged on constitutional grounds, which essentially abolished the statute of limitations for civil claims around sexual misconduct stretching back decades. It was just like a Me Too window, basically, that they wanted to legislatively enact. And if you go and look, it created like an avalanche of claims from decades in the past against a whole variety of figures, including Eric Adams, the mayor, and a million other people. And this was after it was filed. It was filed after basically the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, which was the settlement program drawn from Epstein's estate. After that had essentially closed out and was over with its claims, and also it was right ahead of what would come to be in 2022 Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee year, right? So it was her 70th anniversary of her reign. Every sort of 10, 20, 30, whatever years, every decade, there's like a celebration that's held to commemorate the anniversary of her reign as queen. And she was obviously a sickly old woman at that point. I think it's been reported that she might have had early on-stage cancer. I don't know exactly when she might have gotten it, but essentially she was, nearing death. I think she was 95 years old. And the royal family did not want to blemish the last years of this beloved national figure's life. She had been the head of state of the United Kingdom since the 1950s. Are they going to tarnish that last year of her life?
Let's just get this over with, whatever it takes, type of thing. Okay.
Yeah. By having Prince Andrew, her son, have to go to the United States to stand trial. Imagine the PR shitstorm that would have caused.
So the reason I want to linger on this is because it's that photo is one of the defining pieces of the Epstein story for a lot of people. They see that and it seems very damning. To this, or it seems to suggest this idea that it wasn't contained to Epstein. He was farming these girls out to elites like Andrew, or I'll share a couple other of the photos that get shared quite often. Bill Clinton with this woman named Shantae Davies getting a massage in the airport, and she was, to be clear, not underage at the time these photos were taken, but it is like, it's one of those things where there seems to be a lot of smoke. It's like you're getting on an airplane, getting massages by a guy who's known to get naughty massages from underage girls.
He wasn't and that's not right though. I mean, maybe you're just kind of speaking figuratively or something.
I'm speaking out Epstein.
Yeah. Well, I know, but for example, in 2002, when Shantae Davies did accompany Bill Clinton, Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Kevin Spacey, and Chris Tucker on this trip to Africa, where they made multiple stops to visit, at least ostensibly, Clinton Foundation endeavors in Africa. And believe me, I'm the last person to actually defend on the substance, like whatever the Clinton Foundation was up to. But I'm also not going to just willy-nilly declare that it was like part of some child sex trafficking operation if there's zero credible basis for insinuating or stating that, which there isn't. So Shantae Davies, you're right. She was an adult at the time that she was on this trip. She was an aspiring masseuse. She's like a trainee masseuse or something. There is that photo of Bill Clinton getting a back rub from her, but Shantae Davies, has always said that nothing inappropriate ever happened with Bill Clinton. That was in 2002. So Bill Clinton would have no grounds to know that Epstein might have indulged in Palm Beach in some of these questionable massages. He wouldn't have known. The process, the criminal investigation didn't even start till 2005. The earliest he probably would have known would have been 2006, most likely, given that's when Epstein was indicted by the grand jury in Palm Beach County. So how is that smoke? People just want to think that there's smoke. They want to graft their desires for smoke onto something that is like kind of much more smokeless, but that doesn't like titillate them. So they want to have the most titillating possible interpretation of every possible data point here.
Okay, so let me put to you the sort of maximalist claim. Maybe we can call it the Whitney Webb version of events, whose name you raised earlier, which is that this is a sprawling blackmail scheme, that we're essentially governed by blackmail, and that there's a long history of this. And I think, to be fair to Whitney Webb, there are instances of intelligence agencies using blackmail and organized crime, obviously using blackmail, and sometimes maybe even working together to blackmail people. And her contention is that this is essentially what the Epstein operation was about, that his main benefactor, if you want to call it, or I guess client, Leslie Wexner, ran this organization called the Mega organization, the Mega Group, which was a major kind of pro-Israel organization. And this again ties back to the.
It was a bunch of wealthy people who had like mutual philanthropic interests that were often pro-Israel or pro-Jewish.
So I don't want to get too derailed on Whitney Webb's kind of like grand thesis about the world, but I want to present, I guess, what would be the best little pieces of evidence that there might have been blackmail going on, as far as I can tell. And one is just both the reports and pictures of surveillance equipment in Epstein's houses. So these are pictures from the New York Times, which we will link to. And I have the surveillance cameras circled. One of them is in his bedroom. This contradicts, by the way, Maxwell's testimony. She says
well, not necessarily.
Well, she said she never installed any surveillance cameras, so this could in areas.
This would have been
like
from
bedrooms.
2019. She wouldn't have even been. How could she even have knowledge of what cameras might have been installed in the New York house?
Fair point. And there was this story reported by the Wall Street Journal that Jeffrey Epstein appeared to threaten Bill Gates, who can, by the way, Bill Gates, we should mention, continued to associate with Epstein after the allegations about him came out. But Jeffrey Epstein,
which I find people just like instinctively assume must be like gravely discrediting of Bill Gates or anybody else who continued to meet with Epstein after 2008 or 2009. So that would include people like Peter Thiel, Noam Chomsky, Ehud Barak, Larry Summers.
Isn't that
Woody
fair
Allen.
To throw someone's judgment into question, that you are?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, what judgment should be thrown into question? What would Peter Thiel, for example, who did associate with Epstein post 2009, what could he have possibly known that Epstein did by virtue of his guilty plea in Florida? We were just over it. That he pleaded guilty to felony solicitation of prostitution of adults, and also procurement of person under 18 for prostitution, which related to one 17-year-old formerly And the 17-year-old said that she had engaged in a consensual intercourse with Epstein. So, and then Epstein served out his term. Yes, he did have more favorable conditions that he was able to be obtain related to work release and so forth, because he had kind of like a phony office that was set up adjacent to his lawyer's office, where he would say that he was going to work all day for his money managing things. And but then by July of 2009, he was released from the custody of the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office. So I just don't like this idea that if somebody does their time, quote unquote, then for the rest of their lives, nobody can ever associate with them. Otherwise, they're implicated in some kind of like sexual impropriety. That's ridiculous. That's almost inimical to the American legal.
I do think
actually Noam Chomsky is the only one. Noam Chomsky is the only guy who didn't provide this like spin-dried PR statement where he groveled and said how sorry and regretful he was that he, dishonored the victims by continuing to meet with Jeffrey Epstein. Noam Chomsky, he's just a guy who was like emails. He was like very accessible by email into his 90s. He just replied to the Wall Street Journal and basically said, it's none of your business. I met the guy. I knew him. I had like a minor encounter with him here and there. He helped me move some money around after my wife died. And that's it. Otherwise, he said, screw off. The rest of these people probably went through like multiple layers of PR drafting statements to say how horribly regretful they were that they could have like gone to some soiree at a house from a guy who pleaded guilty to something a decade ago. It's ridiculous. It's moral panic.
Okay, but I do want to just read this excerpt from the Wall Street Journal
Sure.
where about the Gates story. Gates allegedly had this affair with a younger Russian bridge player, and this was in the same period. Epstein was trying to raise money from Bill Gates for a nonprofit venture that he was working on, and Gates declined to give him the money. And after he declined to give Epstein money, the Wall Street Journal reports that he sent an email to Gates asking to be reimbursed for the costs of Antonova's coding school. The sum was immaterial for the two men, and the tone of the message was that Epstein knew about the affair and could expose it, the people said. Surveillance, sending vaguely threatening emails to Bill Gates. Is this at least some circumstantial evidence that this is the character of somebody who might be interested in using any means possible to gain influence?
So Bradley Edwards, the lawyer who basically orchestrated this press conference yesterday, it was more a Bradley Edwards production yesterday, this press conference in front of the Capitol, than even a Ro Khanna or Thomas Massie production, because they haven't been immersed in this issue for years and years. Bradley Edwards has. And he writes in his book, he has a 2020 book called Relentless Pursuit. And Bradley Edwards, like one of the arch legal antagonists of Epstein for 10 years, who basically instigated the whole process whereby Epstein ended up getting re-prosecuted federally by 2019 and then thrown in prison, and then he dies in custody, right? That was really, in large part, the brainchild of Bradley Edwards. So he's the last person you would expect to say anything that was at all exonerating of Epstein. But in this book, he basically says there's never been any compelling evidence that he's ever seen that Epstein engaged in blackmail, right? So that's what Bradley Edwards says. Now, was that email sent to Bill Gates where like something is maybe alluded to? Sure, I guess, I don't know. That the person he allegedly had an affair with wasn't underage, right, or a minor that I know of. I think Epstein would be a braggadocious in that he would love to sort of puff himself up in terms of what kind of impressive connections he had, just as kind of like a social currency. And it was probably like partially true, partially untrue. Like he did know an extraordinary number of people clearly, but maybe he would exaggerate or embellish. He was kind of like a social operator, a networker. And could he have known stuff about the personal lives of various prominent people? Sure. I think there's pretty credible evidence, although I can't give you like the full chapter and verse on this, so maybe I shouldn't even mention it. But there was like a J.P. Morgan executive. His name is Jess Staley, who got embroiled in a bunch of litigation around Epstein because he was basically the executive who was delegated to manage Epstein's money while he was a client of J.P. Morgan. And there's evidence that he visited the notorious island in the Virgin Islands, and potential evidence. Don't quote me on this per se, but I think there's some potential evidence he probably did end up in some kind of romantic or sexual relationship with a young woman, adult it would seem, but a young woman who Epstein might have brought to the island, right? And so, if Epstein knows that Jess Staley, who I think might have been married, I'm not 100% sure. I should look into this a little more in depth. I'm willing to admit, like my knowledge is not fully complete, but let's say let's just hypothesize, right, that this did happen and this guy had a consensual adult relationship with a younger woman, but it could still be embarrassing in some way, and Epstein would be aware of it. Is that possible? Okay, yeah, sure, but like that's such a far cry from these most maximalist blackmail theories that people like Whitney Webb want to pump out and do. I mean, Whitney Webb's book, which, by the way, I'm not trying to be mean, although maybe I am because it's warranted. Her book, it's called One Nation Under Blackmail. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, literally the worst book in terms of just its organization or editing or structure and even writing I've ever attempted to slog through, because I was constantly being browbeaten by people on the internet, commenters who were saying how cowardly I was for not engaging with Whitney Webb's work. She was supposed to be the savant. She was supposed to be, she was enlightening the masses on Jeffrey Epstein, and therefore I must engage with her work. So I try to engage with her work. It's just, it couldn't be more of a tedious slog. But it's One Nation Under Blackmail. That's the title. And the whole theory is basically the United States and the world, I guess, is fundamentally governed by pedophilic interests. People actually believe this. It's actually an ideology. I've gotten too many messages and comments and so forth to have any uncertainty about whether this is actually a real ideology that's subscribed to. I don't know how pervasive it is or prevalent it is, but it clearly does exist. And actually, it's shockingly widespread. People believe that pedo interests, like the United States is a pedo state and fundamentally organized around protecting pedo interests. So some of them think Donald Trump is a pedophile, Bill Clinton must be a pedophile. They let that Israeli guy abscond supposedly from Las Vegas to Israel because the United States it's the United States of pedophilia. People believe this. And so that's Whitney Webb's basic theory. She has said stuff to the effect of that, like Epstein, she has just stated as fact, more or less, that Israel was running a pedo blackmail ring and Epstein was orchestrating it. And that's basically what determines how the U.S. is governed. And I think it's a really insidious, it's a pernicious theory to put out there, because it's almost like demobilizing.
We can say pretty definitively that the evidence is lacking, to say the least.
Not only is the evidence lacking, like, okay, let's say people do come to believe that despite the deficient evidence. Mm-hmm. Then what? I mean, what are they supposed to do? I mean, are they supposed to, like, how do you even then, like, engage with the world if, like, I can almost see people becoming a nihilist. Like, okay, if we're just governed by pedophilic interests of elites, then, like, why get involved with, like, some legislation in Congress, right?
Yeah, the difficult thing about it is that, we're talking about intelligence agencies being involved. We're talking about government officials being involved. And so there's always, it's like if Epstein was connected to intelligence and he was blackmailing people, what would we expect to see differently here? Because there obviously would be a cover up if these connections existed and like the maximalist story was anything close to true. What would you expect, like, as a journalist who wants to find the answer to start?
Well, one thing
what would you be looking for?
One thing I told Whitney Webb when I was, I was beseeched to engage with her. I duly obliged. I read much of the book. I read a bunch of her articles, listened to her podcast, etc. And interestingly enough, people can go read the article on my Substack about this, where I post the email exchange, because it's pretty fascinating in a dark, morbid way. But she tries to claim that, like, she agrees with me on some level that the sex trafficking dimension of the whole Epstein story has been exaggerated or it's been overemphasized. And I asked her, okay, Whitney, how could you possibly say that? Because I have quotes of you saying that the United States is fundamentally governed by protecting pedophilic interests. There was a pedo trafficking ring that was orchestrated by Epstein at the behest of Israel or whomever else. She sometimes she'll say Israel, sometimes she'll just like be more abstract about it. But and this is like what dictates our national governance. So if that were true, right, I would be the first one rushing to cover it. I'm a guy who covers American politics and U.S. foreign policy. So if it were true that every foreign policy action in the Middle East or wherever else was fundamentally dictated or determined by the existence of a pedo sex trafficking ring, gee golly whiz, I'd be first in line to cover that. The problem is there's no evidence that it ever existed, at least at the proportions and like the sweeping, decisive influence that these people claim. And so I just said, okay, Whitney, how could you now be trying to hedge or qualify your statement saying, oh yeah, this stuff is exaggerated? You're one of the exaggerators. If that's the case, you're the one who's saying that this is a set pedo trafficking ring. I mean, I actually think that pedophilic trafficking of genuine children would be really bad. Like if elites really were trafficking genuine children, like if there were actual sexual predation being committed systemically on like an industrial scale to actual children, then yeah, that would be very bad. I would love to expose that or put a stop to it or like do whatever was necessary to like prevent the children from being harmed. It's like the people don't even actually care, I don't think, on some level about whether there is this harm being inflicted on children. They like it as a political device or like this espionage little fairy tale for them to get immersed in on the internet and like, speculate with their dopey friends about or whatever. It gets completely divorced from what the real world ramifications would be if the thing that they want to believe for some weird reason did actually exist. Why do these people have such a bizarre psychic need to want to believe that this exists? Like, shouldn't they be gratified or should they be relieved if child sex trafficking was actually not as pervasive as maybe they've been led to believe? I would be relieved because that means fewer children are being like sexually victimized, right? But they feel like they have like some void in their collective psychology or something where they need to believe this. It's very disturbing. And Whitney Webb's been a huge purveyor of that. Definitely Daryl Cooper, who, again, we should talk maybe more about the journalistic aspect of all this because it's really insidious. It's really horrible in terms of the modern media environment. People who adhere to no factual standards whatsoever are just anointed on these podcasts and whatnot that are hugely popular as like the foremost national authorities on all things Jeffrey Epstein. So people were imploring me to look into this guy, Daryl Cooper, Martyr Made, Tucker Carlson, who I like on a personal level, was a semi-regular guest on his show on Fox. Nothing against him on a personal level, always had a good relationship, but he had on Daryl Cooper, a.k.a. Martyr May. People were, again, like they were with Whitney Webb, imploring me that I must listen to it so I can be humbled and awed and realize how wrong I am about Epstein. I need to be educated by this like sagacious and incredibly knowledgeable podcaster guy. And so I was putting it off. Finally, okay, I gave up and said, fine, I'll listen to it. I mean, this guy, Daryl Cooper, he made up a quote from a federal judge. He made up fake judicial rulings. He just said he made factually false assertions, like he was asked by Tucker. Okay, Daryl Cooper, since you're being heralded as this like leading national expert or on Jeffrey Epstein on the internet, and you've been in the Epstein space, as Daryl Cooper says, for so long, and you have such a vast body of knowledge, tell our audience, since we're doing this like introductory primer, it was like an emergency Epstein podcast. Daryl Cooper was like summoned to rush over to Tucker's studio to enlighten the masses about Epstein if they needed an introduction. And so Tucker's like, okay, give us some introductory facts. Like, for example, who are some examples of prominent people who continued to meet with Jeffrey Epstein after 2009, after he served his prison sentence in Florida? And there are prominent people who did do that. Woody Allen, Ehud Barak, Peter Thiel, Larry Summers, Noam Chomsky. You could have named a whole bunch of people. And what does Daryl Cooper do? He throws out Bill Clinton. I guess because he's on Tucker Carlson's podcast and like you can say whatever you want about Bill Clinton. He also weirdly like makes a point to exonerate Donald Trump. So he'll spuriously connect any dots. Like he'll connect any dots and like make the most salacious possible inference. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he's like presumptively exonerated of any wrongdoing. But Bill Clinton, Darryl Cooper's willing to just make up, falsely assert that Bill Clinton continued to associate with Epstein post-2009, even though there's no evidence after 2005 that Bill Clinton ever associated with Epstein. And I've been a huge critic of Bill Clinton for a whole variety of policy, political reasons. But people need to know that the journalistic authorities that are being presented to the public, whether it's in the alternative media, like the podcast-friendly media, the more conspiracy-adjacent media, or the mainstream media, so people like Julie K. Bryant, the Miami Herald author or journalist who did that original series in 2018 that reinvigorated the Epstein issue and catalyzed, she says, the federal prosecutors to re-prosecute Epstein. She makes up, I swear to God, I guess I'm the only one who noticed this. I read her book, 2021, Perversion of Justice, Julie K. Brown's book. It's dedicated to Virginia Roberts Giuffre. It's dedicated to federal prosecutors. And she gets to a point where she uses, remember that fictionalized memoir manuscript I was talking about that Virginia Roberts Giuffre just dumped a whole bunch of prominent names into, and then her lawyers later had to admit that it was fictionalized to kind of get her off the hook for all the sensational claims that she falsely made, trying to impugn prominent people for sexual crimes. Julie K. Brown, in her book, basically invents new quotes.
This is
based
Virginia
on this
Roberts,
fictionalized memoir manuscript.
This is her.
So you have
this is Virginia Giuffre's book, The Billionaire's Playboy Club,
That's right, yes.
which she
Manuscript.
described, I guess, in the Dershowitz case as a fictionalized account. And you're saying that the journalist who really reinvigorated this case, basically kind of uncritically parroted this book or inserted this book into
not just
her
that, she
account.
fabricated new quotes based on this fictionalized memoir manuscript. So there was a filing in 2019 by lawyers like Edwards, Boys, etc., on behalf of Virginia Roberts Giuffre, saying that this fictionalized memoir manuscript, which had been unearthed over the course of litigation, they were clarifying that this is to be regarded as fictionalized. Prior to that, it was being presented as nonfiction. She was shopping it around to agents, right? She wanted it to be to give rise to a book deal, be made into a movie. And Julie K. Brown not only uncritically parrots it, that's a given. Of course she does that. She invents new quotes that she just kind of concocts based on that fictionalized memoir manuscript. And when I asked her about this, what did she say? No comment. These people don't engage with criticism. They refuse.
Where do you think that this leads, politically? Because there was a time, I'm pulling up a tweet, where Trump was promoting what you call the Epstein mythology. This is a tweet, referencing the hashtag Clinton body count that at the top there you can see was retweeted by Donald Trump back in 2019. And yet now he's, of course, saying that it's a hoax. There's the influencers being handed the Epstein files. Trump saying here in July that Jeffrey Epstein is somebody that nobody cares about. Where do you and you were at a rally yesterday that was headlined by Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, Democrat and Republican, who've both been on this show, by the way.
They're two of the very few members of Congress who I would have any respect for at all on any level.
Yeah.
Meaning they're generally pretty rational. They're willing to buck their own party. Especially Thomas Massie. That's not quite so much Khanna, but a little bit, but definitely Thomas Massie. Donald Trump is vowing to primary Thomas Massie next year because Massie, he adheres to, if you want to call it libertarian or whatever philosophy in terms of his votes, and that angers Trump.
They're asking for full disclosure of the files.
Yeah.
That seems good in principle, right?
If that's what they were asking for, it would be good. But that's not what they're asking for. People should read my Substack. Sorry to be so self-promotional, but I read the bill. I mean, I did something very shocking, and I read the bill that they're promoting. It's called, I think, the Epstein Files Transparency Act or something like that. But if you go and read it, it's very boring. I know Whitney Webb and Darryl Cooper and all these people probably wouldn't do that. They would want, they would probably plop in front of Netflix or Joe Rogan or something. But if you go in and read it, it, first of all, allows or actively empowers the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to unilaterally determine that certain records that are connected to Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell, can remain concealed in perpetuity if she can claim that those records have some bearing on national security. Really? What's the national security dimension here? So for the people who want there to be more investigation of potential intelligence ties that Epstein might have had to different intelligence agencies, whether American or Israeli or anything else, you're getting the opposite with this Kana Massey bill, because you're giving the government a new justification to continue concealing files.
If you were advising on this, you would like to see it crafted in a way that does not have a national security exemption, and also
not just that.
Does not redact names of people, even if they are victims.
Right. So that's another big problem, right? So if you go and go back and look at that FBI DOJ memo of July 6th, which I'm so grateful that it launched the summer of Epstein, because it's been the best summer of my life. It says that there are many materials that are intertwined with the identifying information of victims, something to that effect. I might not have the quote exactly right. Intertwined, I know, is the word. So if you do a Control F, you'll find it. So basically, they're saying that records are being withheld because they are intertwined with identifying information on the
sensitive information relating to these victims is intertwined throughout the material.
Right. So if you go and look at the text of this bill by Massey and Kana, it continues to enable the government to conceal records on the grounds that we must prevent the disclosure of materials that could be intertwined with identifying information of reported victims. And a huge percentage of the still yet to be released materials are going to have some intertwinement with materials that could be identifying of quote unquote victims. So why is it that in perpetuity, for all time now, we're supposed to accept, especially for the people who are clamoring for disclosure of Epstein's files, which again, I do agree with on principle, but in practice, if you're willing to allow for these exceptions where anything that can have some peripheral connection to any little bit of identifying information about a victim can remain concealed, then you're going to be deprived of a huge quantity of records. That's the basis on which many records are still being kept under judicial seal in New York and in Florida in federal court. And in terms of the DOJ and the executive branch, there are certain statutes that they claim that they have to adhere to in terms of protecting the privacy of victims. And remember, these victims, so many of these quote unquote victims have never even been adjudicated as victims. They've just been declared as victims. And none of them are children at all at this point. So they're all adults. So I would argue that there's an overriding public interest, given the outsized fascination and outrage and political upheaval over the story, for us to do away with these stupid excuses for why materials can be concealed around supposedly protecting victims and put it all out there. Yes, including material that may end up defaming, potentially, prominent individuals, because Virginia Roberts Giuffre spewed an incredible amount of defamatory claims at prominent people that almost never held up to any scrutiny at all. And that's an ethical quandary. We don't want to just allow people to be famed willy-nilly by the release of government records. But I think this is a special circumstance where at least I would argue that the public interest is best served, the historical record is best served, the political climate is best served by total disclosure. And the Kana Massey bill is an impediment to that. It allows.
It does seem that it's never. This is never going to end. The speculation is never going to end unless some sort of radical transparency like that happens. Because then there's always going to be, well, why is that redacted? Why is this information being withheld? Does that connect some more dots? So that does make sense.
In the Ghislaine Maxwell proffer interview with Todd Blanche, absurdly enough, the name Virginia Roberts Giuffre is redacted, as though anybody who is not like 1% familiar with this whole case would know who's being referred to. So they even redact her ridiculously in that document.
I do want to start to bring this to a close, but
I
want to ask you about your presence at this press conference.
Yes.
My
very disturbing and dangerous and shameful presence.
You were kicked out, actually, and we have a clip of that we're going to play.
Edwards, right here, please. Mr. Edwards? Yes, so you represented Virginia Roberts Giuffre for many years. She eventually had to recant the allegations that she made against Alan Dershowitz. She alleged that on at least 6 occasions she had been sex trafficked to Dershowitz. She recanted that question. And so why is it that she should be regarded as credible in this respect? You're not going to answer the question? Is that an unfair question?
The allegations, there's a simple answer. Release the files. Let the American public decide. Instead of harassing, I gave you your say. Look.
Against a prominent individual among others. You're hired by Dershowitz. And then had to admit other counsel.
You know, even
he knows what I'm talking about. That contained hugely salacious allegations against a whole.
You've been heard.
Shouldn't you tell the public about this?
You've been heard. And even Alan Dershowitz says release the files. Release the files. That is the answer, and that's what we're here for. That is
Can you elaborate on You said that Donald Trump gave you help in 2009. Can you elaborate on your interactions with Donald Trump back in 2009? And for any of the victims,
why is that the question that you wanted to pose to them?
Okay. Yeah, so just to back up for a minute, I was invited to attend this press conference by the staff of Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna organized the press conference along with Thomas Massie and Bradley Edwards. So I was an invited member of the press to attend this public press conference. I was escorted into the press conference area by one of Ro Khanna's staff. I had every conceivable right to be there in the world and ask whatever question that I wanted. And clearly, the expectation is that no critical questions are ever going to be asked at all about any aspect of this issue, right? That's why the question that I did ask caused such an uproar. That's why everybody took such offense to it. That's why it led to Marjorie Taylor Greene basically whipping up a mob and calling out, you can see her on video, calling out to the Capitol Police for me to be forcibly ejected from the premises. That's insane. They weren't objecting to anything I did that was genuinely disruptive. I did not genuinely disrupt anything at all. I waited my turn. I asked a question. Bradley Edwards, when I asked him this question about Virginia Roberts Giuffre, here's basically what I asked him. Or you've heard it, so I don't need to rehearse it. But I wanted to ask Bradley Edwards, who represented Virginia Roberts Giuffre for many years, made all manner of sensational, ridiculous, defamatory claims on her behalf, is very much individually responsible, meaning Edwards, for fomenting this moral panic and mass hysteria by virtue of his representation of Virginia Roberts Giuffre. I wanted to ask him to explain to the public, why is it that we should regard this person as at all remotely credible? She was probably one of the least credible people who ever existed. And yet, at this press conference, she was being, heralded and venerated as though, again, she was this martyr. She was this martyr for truth and justice. And it couldn't be further from the truth. So I'm against the allowing for, or just acceding to, the continued unchecked propagation of this ridiculous mythology without any kind of journalistic intervention to keep people grounded, at least in some semblance of fact. So I asked that question. Edwards brushes it off, right? And of course, the other journalists in my vicinity don't care that they brush it off, because they just want to ask superficial questions, whether about, please comment on Trump, please comment on some other kind of transient aspect of this. They don't care. They don't look into the details. So Bradley Edwards brushes me off and goes to this other woman to ask a question, and the woman asks her question, and he's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Meaning, he's telling Bradley Edwards, it's fine. Forget about Michael Tracey, who asked his mean old question. It's fine. We can move on. I will now ask you a more amenable question, right?
Right.
And so you can hear me saying to this woman, what do you mean? What do you mean? Well, we're not good. She says we're good.
And I believe I heard someone also accuse you of working for Alan Dershowitz. Let me just ask you straight up, are you working for Alan Dershowitz?
Absolutely. No, of course I'm not working for Alan Dershowitz. Tara Palmieri, another journalist who's on CNN all the time, or MSNBC as their big in-house Epstein expert. She formerly worked for ABC News. She was she's more in the mainstream. She's very much involved in deceiving people within the more mainstream media. She's not as much of a podcaster, although she does some podcasts. But I invited her very politely, very gently, as nicely as I possibly could. Look, I know I'm a mean guy with a beard or whatever, But like I was trying to be as nice and cordial and inviting to her as I possibly could. But she agreed to come on a Substack live stream with me. And I wanted to talk about her journalistic philosophy, because in 2020, Tara Palmieri did this podcast for Sony Music, essentially, called Broken. I'm almost positive that was the name. It was an Epstein podcast. So it's supposed to be like the most authoritative at the time Epstein podcast. It was produced by a production company that was run by Adam McKay, the Hollywood director. And the whole premise of this podcast series that she did with Virginia was that she was going to be not just covering Virginia Roberts-Giuffre, the chronic fabricator, provably. She was going to journalistically collaborate with Virginia Roberts-Giuffre. And they did it. They went around and supposedly tracked down people in her past.
Another example.
And so on this live stream, Tara Palmieri accuses me of working for Dershowitz because I asked her a very modestly challenging question. So people just want to assume that you have some foul motive. I can't tell you how many millions of times I've been told by people on the internet that I need to have my hard drive checked by the FBI because they assume that I'm sexually depraved or I want to sexually victimize children. Of course, it's not true, but I'm never going to be able to convince people of that if that's what they want to go to in terms of impugning my motives. They don't want to actually deal with the substance.
I think that's
they want to assume that I'm personally,
honestly, Michael,
depraved.
I think it's a big reason why people maybe have been scared to.
I agree. It's why nobody wants to engage.
That you're raising because they.
Who wants to be called a pedophile 24/7 on the internet? It's not pleasant.
Yeah, there's no incentive on either side.
I agree.
To ask these questions.
I'm wired a little differently though, for better or worse.
Yeah, so that's very apparent.
But yeah, somebody actually echoed Tara Palmieri, which is like on the basis of nothing, accused me of working for Alan Dershowitz. Of course I'm not working for Alan Dershowitz. I've spoken to him at length. I'll just tell you, I don't care. I mean, I've spoken to him at length. The last time I spoke to him at any length, I have spoken to him. Last time I spoke to him at any length was in 2023, and it was about something totally unrelated. It was about one of the Trump prosecutions from his interregnum period. And I did a podcast with him in 2019, and it was on the Mueller report. Because Alan Dershowitz at the time had written the introduction to like a commercial book, essentially a book version of the Mueller report. He wrote the introduction. I want to talk about the Mueller report. That's what I've talked to Alan Dershowitz about. If people want to infer that means I'm being paid by him or an agent of him, Tara Palmieri said I was sicked on her by Alan Dershowitz, as I was like an agent of Dershowitz. It's insane. But like, think of the journalistic mentality, okay? Look, I know not every journalist is in like solidarity with one another. It's not like some, fraternity or sorority. But for this woman to just say, oh, no, it's okay, Bradley Edwards. We know that you totally blew this guy off who asked a totally legitimate question, but like, we're good. So you can hear me saying to her, no, we're not good. I mean, the guy just like totally ignored my question. You don't care? And then, okay, but at that point, I was willing to accept that Bradley Edwards had just blown me off. That would be telling in its own right. But then what happens is Ro Khanna interjects. He comes back to the podium and addresses me. Because I know Ro Khanna. I know Thomas Massie a little bit as well. But I know Ro Khanna. And Ro Khanna wants to address my question. So he answers my question. I then ask a follow-up question because he has re-engaged me. And that, I guess, is taken as cause for it to be declared that I need to be forcibly ejected by the Capitol Police from this press conference. For what exactly? I don't know. Marjorie Taylor Greene is on camera there saying, get rid of him, get rid of him. The fake victims, because almost all of them that I've been able to examine so far are like fake victims or fake survivors, meaning that there's no credible claim for their victimhood. And they're multimillionaires, many of them. But they're all in like a mob frenzy. They become like an unruly mob. They're demanding that I be ejected. Get him out of here. It's like a Salem witch trial. Look, I'm not a witch. I'm not a martyr. I'm not trying to make it out like I'm the victim. But like, it's very emblematic of the dynamics that are operative around the story, that for me to even ask the most straightforward but yes, critical question at a press conference where you're supposed to show up and ask critical questions, right? That's the job of a journalist, I thought, but journalists were aghast. Oh my God, how could you ask a critical question at a press conference? That's not what press conferences are for. You know what they're for? They're to serve as a PR vehicle for these purported victims to amplify their stories or like give them a voice or whatever. That's what the journalists think that their proper role is. And also, of course, to get a little narrative, twist so they can somehow attack Trump. That's basically what they want to do. They don't actually want to delve into the substance. And it's just, it's revolting because, look, this is a problem. We've been talking for a long time now. I'm happy to do it. I could go on forever, as you could probably tell. But this mass hysteria, has occasioned huge civil liberties violations. We didn't even touch on all of them. Huge misdiagnosis of political problems where people think, oh, you want to understand how to critique the U.S. relationship with Israel, for example? We now have to do it through the prism of sexual blackmail that we fantasized and we just conjured up in our hallucinatory minds. It's occasioned the collapse of journalistic standards, which I care about a lot. And it's allowed just like mass hysteria and moral panic to proliferate unchecked, I think is damaging unto itself. So for these journalists to be so blasé or casual, they just don't care. I mean, they're just like morons. And like, I'm not like some hero or anything, but seriously, it's horrible. I haven't been, so I was thrown out. I was threatened with arrest. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who you would think that these journalists would want to demonize, right? Most of the time, Marjorie Taylor Greene would be somebody that they would most mainstream journalists would in an instant want us to call some kind of fascist or whatever, MAGA stooge. She basically commands the Capitol Police to forcibly remove me. Ro Khanna, whose staff invited me, who knew I was there, who made a point to engage with me, didn't want me removed. You could see him in the video saying, no, don't remove him. But he's overridden because they've turned into an angry mob, partially summoned by Marjorie Taylor Greene. By the way, Marjorie, I've already said this, and I don't want to be melodramatic about it, but seriously, I'm not even kidding. I'm not trying to be funny, although I'm a really funny guy. This I'm saying with total humorlessness. Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you are listening to this, you crossed the line, because I'm all in favor of extremely heated, contentious political debate, political disagreement, even bitter, insulting political debate if it comes to it. You crossed the line. You tried to have me arrested based on the content of a question that I asked at a public press conference that I was invited to. You didn't like the substance of the question, therefore you wanted me arrested. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, you are an enemy of mine. And I know that might sound silly, but seriously, this transcends whatever political or journalistic sort of back and forth I might have considered you in before. You are an enemy. You are a menace. And I'm vowing here that I will do whatever it takes to, I don't know what I'm going to do exactly. I'm just telling you that you are an enemy of mine. And I haven't said that for any other politician, not Donald Trump, not whomever. If you want to try to get me arrested because you don't like the contents of a question that I asked at a public press conference, really, then some special treatment is needed to you. And I don't know what it is yet. I'm not making a threat against you, please, of violence or anything. I'm saying you are an enemy, because it's unbelievable that would be countenanced. I haven't gotten any phone calls or emails from there's all these journalistic nonprofits like Society of Professional Journalists, Freedom of the Press. We love to stand up for the profession. I haven't been inundated with calls and emails offering to defend me. Not that I want it, not that I care, but it just tells you that, when it comes to this story, people don't want actual journalism to be done. They want PR to be done on behalf of the supposed victims. And then they'll pretend that the little adversarial slant that they'll do on it journalistically is to try to, basically harangue Trump on some fleeting aspect of it.
Okay, so I think we've there's a lot more we could talk about, but this was exhaustive. Yes.
How long have we been going? I've lost track.
Over 2.5 hours.
Okay, good.
And we've you've deconstructed various aspects of what you call the Epstein mythology. And
I'd like to ask you a question as we wrap up.
Okay, yeah, but let me ask this first. And I'm obviously leaving it. We're just putting all this information out there, and
sure.
People need to interpret it. But it is natural to have a narrative framework and have a kind of idea of what the Epstein story is at any given point in time. So let me ask you now that you've gone deep into this and you've deconstructed what you think is a wrong version of the Epstein story. What is the Epstein story at this moment?
Yeah. So, this might sound evasive or a cop-out. It's genuinely not meant to be. But I'm a little wary of sort of accepting this idea that I need to present my own master theory of Epstein or something, right? I guess I could maybe do it, but to me, it's reminiscent of the faulty style of reasoning that I see to be as so widespread in terms of the bogus mythological narrative, right? People think, oh, we have to have this like master narrative or master theory, even if we don't have all the facts. Maybe it sounds right. Maybe we'll connect a few dots, or like we'll weave together some narratives that sounds like coherent to us, or is emotionally satisfying, or politically gratifying, or whatever. And I guess there is part of me that resists that impulse in the first place. Like, what is the Jeffrey Epstein story? Gee, I don't know. Like, what was the war on terror? What was World War II? I mean, like, it's hard to really encapsulate, I guess. So, but if I had to, like, if you put a gun to my head, or maybe you wouldn't have to go that far, but because like it doesn't take that kind of, yeah, it doesn't even take that kind of threat to get me to talk about Jeffrey Epstein in any respect at this point. Incorrigible. But, you know, I would say it's funny because it's so interwoven now with, I think, with the faulty stuff, with the fake stuff, with the mythological stuff. So if I'm gonna give like a nutshell version of it, it's gonna be in part like a refutation or rebuttal of like why it on faulty grounds came to be such a public preoccupation and came to be so falsely understood or construed, right? I don't know. Here's what I'll say, okay? And I hope this isn't too much of a cop-out. I will just say that however long we've been talking right now, almost invariably, when I've had a lengthy discussion with somebody who's intelligent, who thinks that they know certain things, or they maybe just assume certain things about the Epstein case, they just absorb maybe snippets, maybe they looked into a little bit, but not in great depth. I even had this yesterday with a New York Times columnist who will go unnamed. I don't know. I don't want to say that this person was fully convinced, but they seemed definitely much more receptive than you might imagine to just me giving my overview. And, you know, if you're not careful, the overview will lead to like, you know, at least 3 hours of these kind of winding discussions. But I'm saying the different discussions that I have had with intelligent people of varying lengths, but, you know, detailed enough where definitely they say that they learned things that they didn't know. That's a big response I get to my Substacks in particular lately. Like, oh my God, how did I not know this? This seems like it would have been a central part of the narrative, but like it took you, Michael Tracey, to, you know, put it on Substack. What I would say is that if you give me an hour with somebody and we can talk rationally, my experience is that invariably they come to drastically revise their views on Epstein. They come to realize that, gee, maybe there was just a whole lot of mythology that I sort of unthinkingly absorbed, because there seemed to be such a consensus around why it must be so. And I never thought there was really much of a need to interrogate the details or do any kind of robust critical examination of anything. And so that pattern that I've observed, I think is sort of what I want to use to encapsulate my little synopsis or whatever of what the Epstein story is. I think it's an example of a mythological kind of construct, at least like 90% of it. We went over the other 10%. We could go into it in more detail maybe in part 2, although I can't imagine how you'd have the tolerance to do that. But it's a mythological construct that through a combination of media malfeasance, media laziness, political opportunism, political cynicism, genuine delusion, genuine hallucinatory investment in something, all kinds of unpleasant psychological, political, sociological, legal factors kind of converged or congealed into this overwhelmingly fictitious narrative that has become dominant in American politics, and it has all these other deleterious downstream effects that we've discussed. And I think there needs to be some accounting of this. Not that I woke up one morning on July 7th of 25 rather, and said I have to dedicate my life to Jeffrey Epstein. Although I have been, you know, again, intermittently interested, but like I was so amazed that like nobody even bothered to do the basics. They would rather just, because they're maybe afraid of being called a pedo on the internet, I guess. I mean, please. I mean, if you're now going to let yourself be dictated in terms of what you cover or what you journalistically examine based on like the pushback you get on the internet, then I think we're really screwed, because like that's never going to be not a thing. So that's basically how I guess I would summarize it. And I hope summarize what the Epstein story is. I hope you didn't perceive that as an evasion.
No, not at all. That's I think that's a great takeaway. And we, you know, the kind of forbidden areas of journalism or inquiry are always shifting, and they're always surprising. You wouldn't, you wouldn't think it used to be like talking about Jeffrey Epstein was like the sort of naughty or forbidden thing, and now it's like questioning this overarching narrative. So I do absolutely respect the kind of independence of thought.
The pendulum swings.
I think you had a question for me before I give you the final question.
Oh yeah, I just blame because like as I mentioned, more often than not, actually almost universally, invariably, when I have a discussion of this sort with somebody, whether it's in public, in a podcast format, or in private, they often come away saying that they've revised their views or they've adjusted their sort of premises around what they perceive the Epstein story to be on some level. So, I don't know how closely you followed my entire output. I guess I gathered that you read some Substack or whatever, or watched some stuff, but like, I guess just based on this. Okay, good. So, what influence has it had on you? I'm not trying to ask you to kiss my ass or anything, but whether it's this conversation or the stuff you've read before.
Yeah, I mean, I try to go towards subjects where I think I'm going to learn something if I engage with it. And I'd say engaging with your material and mostly, to be honest, the kind of background research preparing for this, but also in the course of this conversation, it was those aspects of the kind of tenuous relationship with intelligence. I thought that there was there was stronger evidence there because of the weird Acosta stuff that we went over. And yeah, I had not been familiar before reading your work with this OPM report, and that certainly has made me rethink
the OPR report. The nitpickers will come after us if I don't clarify.
So yeah, I really appreciate you adding some, nuance to the story and making people question, because it has become, at least in media world, I'm not going to say all consuming, but just that fog that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. And I think you're whether people agree or not that your analysis is 100% on, at least you're trying to clear away some of the distractions. So with that, in that spirit, let me ask you the final question of the show, which we pose to all of our guests. The show's called Just Asking Questions. What is a question that you...
Jacking off, I think it's called.
Yeah. What's a question that you think that more people should be asking?
A question more people should be asking.
Yeah, and it can be about Epstein, or it can be a more general question.
I almost want to give myself like a test to see if I can come up with a question that does not relate to Jeffrey Epstein, just to make sure I'm like not totally lost, or like sucked into a vortex, so I can like extricate myself. Question that people should be asking. Okay, here's one, and I'll sort of I could potentially tie this to Epstein, but I'm going to deliberately not, just so that the viewers understand that like this is not necessarily my entire life, although it's been a big percentage of it, I'll say, this summer. Here's a question people should be asking: to what extent did the alternative media and its ascendance, meaning the podcast circuit, Joe Rogan in particular, and his like satellites that he kind of platformed or gave a lot of notoriety to what extent did their outsized significance in the 2024 presidential election contribute to misinforming younger voters in particular who do not rely on mainstream media, for whom these podcasts like Theo Vaughn or Joe Rogan or Andrew Schultz, these things, they're much more likely to go to those sources for quote unquote news than they would traditional outlets. So that that's kind of like an ineluctable sort of trend. But to what extent did the ascendance of those outlets and the Trump campaign's very skillful co-optation of them, or use of them, to be a little bit more charitable, for their own political ends, to what extent did that contribute to misinforming the public en masse about what Trump was actually going to do while he was in office? Because like, I know a lot of people who like basically get their information from those sources who thought, oh yeah, Trump is like somehow secretly anti-Israel, or there's no way he could bomb Iran, right? There's no way his big first foreign policy proposal of his second administration would be to come out into the Oval Office or wherever he was, whatever he was in the White House with Benjamin Netanyahu and say, the United States is going to seize Gaza as a U.S. military protectorate. That was his big proposal. There's no way, right, that Trump is going to continue to arm Ukraine. There's no way that Trump is going to totally blunder to the point of total absurdity on all these conflicts he claimed that he was going to be able to solve. Remember, it never would have happened if he had been in president. He'll say over and over again, whether it's the conflict in the Middle East or Israel or Ukraine. And so I think that there are lots of people I know who are, especially who are sort of immersed in the online information space, who feel like they've been tricked or deceived, or that they're shocked or appalled or dismayed by what Trump has been doing in his second term. And not to toot my own horn, but like, I've been surprised by almost nothing. Like, they're apparently doing another regime change gambit in Venezuela, and we're supposed to, I guess some people, if you watch like Theo Vaughn or Joe Rogan or Andrew Schultz, maybe you might find this surprising. But, if you're a little bit more reality-based, you might recall that Trump in 2019, when he was president the first time, also attempted to do a regime change gambit in Venezuela. Marco Rubio was his point person in the Senate on that failed regime change gambit. He's now the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, so like the most influential foreign policy person in a presidential administration since Henry Kissinger. And so a lot of this was foreseeable. So here's what the question I think more people should be asking. Did the over-reliance on or the ascendance of this alternate media ecosystem deceive people in terms of what they could expect from a second Trump administration? I would argue it did. And we could do another 3 hours on that, but it's probably time to wrap up.
No, yeah, I think it's a fair question. And, as the kind of ongoing theme of this conversation has been that there's dubious methods both in the alternative media and the establishment media around the Epstein story, and I think that that's possibly symptomatic of something bigger beyond just the Epstein story. And critiquing one or the other, critiquing one doesn't mean you're excusing the other. And probably what we need is some sort of synthesis that is either better than both. And hopefully that's what we're headed for in the wake of all this. But Michael Tracey, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an interesting conversation, and keep up the work. You can find Michael Tracey's work at Substack. Anywhere else that we should point people?
Mostly Substack, mtracy.net, Tracy with an E. I do have a YouTube channel that I throw some stuff on, so that's the same mtracy. Then mtracy on X, and that's about it.
Perfect. Thanks.
But yeah, this was enjoyable, edifying, I think. So, and I applaud anyone who had the stamina to sit through all of it.
Thanks, Michael.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.